Hey, my name is Chris Brennan, and you're listening to the Astrology Podcast. In this episode, I'm going to be talking with astrologer Bruce Scofield about his new book titled The Nature of Astrology, History, Philosophy, and the Science of Self-Organizing Systems. So hey, Bruce, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Hi.
Yeah, thanks for joining me today, and congratulations on the release of the book. I literally just finished reading it this morning before we did this interview, and I'm honestly, legitimately pretty blown away. So I'm excited to talk to you about it today. And first, just wanted to say, congratulations, because I realize this book is kind of like your magnum opus, I think. And I not that I didn't expect that going into it, but I didn't really expect to read almost like this summation of a person's life work in astrology to a certain extent to be in there. And I realize it's not everything you've ever done in astrology, but certainly there was a tone to it that seemed like you were trying to make this like a really great book.
Well, I was trying to answer the question that I've had for about 60 years now, which is, what is astrology? And, I've approached it from a lot of different angles. And I thought, before I started, falling apart physically or possibly mentally, I needed to get something written. And the pandemic helped a little bit. I was able to get more done then. So
Nice.
I'm glad I got it off my chest, and it's out there. I still have other thoughts as well, but I was primarily trying to answer the question that I've had for so long. What is astrology? What is it? How did we get there? Why is it, marginalized? Those are big questions.
Yeah, and the book is roughly divided into three specific parts. Right. And could you just briefly summarize what those three different parts are?
Yeah, they're kind of standalone in some ways. You probably could make 3 books out of it, but the first part is trying to show that what astrology is measuring is pretty much the same thing as what some of the other sciences, particularly biology and geosciences, are trying to measure as well. I have an account of my own experiments with astrometeorology, and I try to bring the reader into a way of thinking scientifically about astrology.
Yeah, and it seems like one of the things that's really unique about your book, and right away from chapter 1, you get into it, is contrary to the prevailing trend over the past 2 or 3 decades, you explicitly try to argue that for some sort of causal mechanism behind astrology, and that astrology, you open the book basically talking about a number of different ways in which the Earth itself and its inhabitants are influenced by different things going on in the solar system or in the universe. And it seems like through that, you try to start making a case that perhaps there's something then that could make room for some sort of causal mechanism in astrology.
Yeah, I'm not really arguing that astrology is entirely, or even, I'm not saying that astrology can be based on physical mechanisms, but I am pointing out there are plenty of physical mechanisms we already know about that kind of fit that bill. I'm putting that out there. I'm not taking a physicalist position, I'm not necessarily materialist. I'm not taking an idealist position that the universe is all consciousness. I'm basically saying, I don't know. I'm really more of a naturalist, that I'm the kind of guy that's out there studying what's around me and, trying to see it as, all part of one larger scheme.
Right.
But yeah, you're right. There does seem to be it does start off in a way that would imply that there are physical mechanisms to astrology, because there are quite a few.
Well, and also because later in the book, you explicitly go out of your way to reject the model of astrology that tries to contextualize it or view it within the context of divination. It's become so popular over the past 3 decades through the work of Jeffrey Cornelius to a major extent, but also some other astrologers that have followed him. And so I guess that's why I got the impression that you were trying to look at the other side and you were trying to present a case for a more naturalistic view of astrology that views it as like a natural property of the cosmos, rather than something that's purely linked to religion or divination or magic or other things like that?
Yeah. Did you notice that my image is now frozen? I can't seem to move I can move my neck in this reality here, but not in the. Anyway, yeah. In regard to the idea that astrology is divination, I just think it's a counterproductive idea. It's divination is not really explained except maybe in the context. Oh, look, I'm moving again. Except maybe in the context of Neoplatonism or some kind of Hermeticism. It's to me, it's like that's too easy of an answer. It gets you off the hook. It's divination. We don't need to really explain what divination is. And I think one of the things I say is that what people call divination is largely the activity of the subconscious, and which we know a little bit about, intuition and maybe some extrasensory perceptions, could be added to that. What I'm really trying to say is that astrologers have faced this issue of what is astrology for a long time, and in modern times, the explanation as divination, I think, is a weak one. That's all I'm really saying.
I think you also sort of give a similar, albeit slightly lighter treatment to synchronicity as like an explanatory mechanism for astrology. And I think you call it like a non-explanation for astrology, or a non-mechanism at one point.
Yeah, and I also say that Jung dropped it himself. He was going to publish on it. And then when he heard about some of the work that I think John Nelson and maybe Jane Blizzard and a few others were doing with planetary alignments around the sun, correlating with solar storms and radio interference, that sort of thing, he kind of dropped it.
Yeah, I mean, I think I did a previous episode with Kieran LeGrice where we explored how, like most astrologers, Jung entertained a number of different theories for how astrology worked during the course of his life. And in the end, had at least like 10 different theories that he entertained at different points. Yeah.
And he hung around with some physicists, Pauly and a few others probably. And, so he was a scientist, he was looking for answers, and not, it's when you're doing that, you don't really jump on any one bandwagon or another. You keep your mind open to different things.
Right.
So, so the explanation of synchronicity as an explanation, I think, is really not much better than the Stoics' explanation of sympathy.
Sure.
It's an interesting idea, but where's the evidence?
Yeah. So I just want to circle back though. Your book is unique to me because you're one of the only major astrologers I've seen in recent times that is arguing that there may be some sort of mechanism behind astrology that is not pure. Or at least some of it. Or at least some of it. Yeah. Because, so that maybe that's...
And I make that clear.
Maybe that's how we should approach it, is that you do set up and try to revive the ancient distinction, that there may still be some validity to the medieval distinction between natural astrology and judicial astrology. And maybe that was your goal with the first few chapters, is to set up some instances where there's genuine celestial influences on earthly events, especially on biology, on weather, and other natural systems on Earth.
Yeah. I like to make that distinction anyway. I mean, I think it's a good one. One of my big arguments in the books is I think astrologers ought to get rid of this idea that astrology is nothing more than a practice. I mean, I think that's really counterproductive. It's a subject. If you don't think it's a subject, what's going on here? So, like medicine, there's a practice, and then there's theory, and then there's research, and then there's a history. And I think astrology is the same. Psychology is like that as well. Most subjects are like that, but subjects like psychology and medicine and astrology are big on practice. I mean, that's a huge part of it. But in the astrological community today, of people that call themselves astrologers, 99.9% of them think that astrology is nothing but more than a practice. And then they go on and argue whether it's a science or an art. And to me, that's, ass backwards.
Sure. So you point out, you emphasize in the book how the majority of astrologers are practitioners of the subject, but that there's not, because it doesn't have, for example, institutional support, there's not a lot of focus on broader, for example, like scientific or statistical research, or even to a certain extent that broader attempts to provide a new philosophical and cosmological context for astrology, or to create a new overarching paradigm for it that meets up with modern science and other contemporary views about the world and the cosmos, that those are sort of few and far between.
Yeah, the lack of institutions is a terrible thing because, if you want to do research, you're not going to get paid for it. That's what it comes down to. So if you want to make a living at astrology, if you're, like I was, when I was younger, I was very interested in it. And I realized that to sustain that interest, I needed to practice it. So I did that. I started a consulting business and went on for a long time. And it was very satisfying, but I always wanted to know these other things. And, I would break it down into basically two categories that could use institutional support: theory and research. And theory could be overarching, but it could just be a hypothesis. And a hypothesis is great because then that guides research. And then when you get into research, there's different ways of doing that. Statistics is usually applied, but there may be other ways of doing it. I mean, certainly correlation studies go on all the time. Publishing a list of famous horoscopes was the original way of doing astrology research, anecdotal evidence. But there may be other ways of going about it. But those two areas, I think, really could use some help, and other people recognize that. Organizations like NCGR and ESAR were founded because of that. That recognition that there needed some, to be some attention paid to these topics.
Yeah, and I think that's really important because that's something you emphasize, is how in the 1960s and 70s there was much more excitement and a feeling of potential in terms of astrological research, and astrologers were more interested, especially in attempts to validate astrology scientifically, and even set up, in some instances, organizations that were specifically supposed to be geared towards that, such as the International Society for Astrological Research or the National Council for Geocosmic Research. But at the same time period where there was that huge influx of younger astrologers into the community from the baby boomer generation who came of age in the 60s and 70s, and astrology became so wildly popular with the public, there was also the rise of major pushback against astrology from skeptics and scientists to a certain extent. And you sort of document to a certain extent in the book the history of some of that and how that sort of squashed some of the enthusiasm, at least in the astrological community, for pursuing scientific research of astrology.
Oh, yeah, it was terrible. It was astrology went from being pretty respected in the 70s to, by the 80s, it was on the bottom shelves of the bookstores right after tarot cards. I mean, it really lost a lot of credibility and status, and I think that was because the self-appointed pit bulls of science that that call themselves skeptics, went at it. It was astrology that largely created the committee for this, for the investigation of the claims. What is it? SciCop, Committee for the Scientific Investigation of the Claims of the Paranormal, something like that, right? That was a result of fear of astrology, right? Astrophobia.
Right. Well, and wasn't SciCop partially founded as wasn't one of their first tests to attempt to replicate supposedly Gauquelin's studies of astrology? So therefore,
and they cheated.
Right. That's one of the great sort of like terrible incidences that happened, which was they initially replicated his study, but they were so convinced ideologically that astrology couldn't be true that they were convinced that there must be a flaw. So they held back releasing their results, basically. And eventually one of the skeptics, one of the founders of the organization, was so disgusted with what they were doing that he sort of wrote an article sort of putting everything out and sort of explaining exactly what had happened and how terrible that was from the perspective of the skeptics.
Yeah, Star Baby with a small S and a capital T. Yeah, as Rollins. Yeah, he published it in Fate magazine. Do you remember that magazine?
I don't, because I was born in like 1984, so a lot of this is like a little bit. I was more into like Ghostbusters and stuff like that in the 80s than reading scientific journals at the time. But I did do a whole episode on this and Gauquelin and his work with Ken Irving several years ago, so people can definitely check that out for more. But that's a good example. So backing up a little bit, because that's something you go into a lot in this book, especially in the second part. You go into the history and the circumstances behind the decline of astrology in the Western world around the time of the scientific revolution. And then I think in the third book, you focus more on some of the recent history of scientific research into astrology, and also talk about the future of astrology from your perspective. Mm-hmm. So you attempt to cover, like you said, like basically this could be 3 separate books all in one. And that's why I kind of called it your magnum opus in some sense at the beginning. Could you explain a little bit your academic background? Because I think some of your prior academic work is tied in with at least the first part of the book, and especially like your PhD thesis, right?
Yeah. It's, in the 60s, I was a kid of the 60s and playing in rock and roll bands in the early 60s. And I went to Rutgers, started in 1966, but it was really hard to stay focused. I was a geology major, and then I changed to meteorology, but mostly I was getting stoned and taking acid and playing rock and roll. So I dropped out. And then when I dropped out, I went out to Haight-Ashbury and I met all these people, and I was from New Jersey, and people in New Jersey. And some of them were into astrology. My girlfriend was into astrology. And this, I had to check out. I mean, being a science guy originally, I had to check it out. And I read some books. I picked up some Alan Leo books, and there was, some Safarial, old stuff. And I said, wow, the heck is this? And I calculated my chart. I knew enough math to do it pretty easily. And that convinced me I had to go back to college because I had to figure out what this was. So I went back to Rutgers and I got a degree in history. I tried to focus on, actually tried to get an independent major based around astrology, and Ken Nagus was going to support me, but the rest of the committee wouldn't. So I wound up taking a lot of history and philosophy courses and kind of sharpening up my mind. And then after another 10 years off, I got a master's degree, and I focused on history of science. And I wrote a master's thesis on John Goad, who shows up in the book quite a bit, who was a 17th century writer who actually tested astrology and wrote a massive book on it. I would consider it the most serious piece of astrological research of the 17th century, and maybe from up until then, even up into the 19th century or so. And so I worked on that, and then there was another gap or so, and I went to UMass and got a PhD in geosciences, and I was lucky enough to have an advisor, Lynn Margulis, who is evolutionist and microbiologist. Do you know anything about her?
I know she was married to Carl Sagan at one point.
Yeah, that was her first husband, but she was associated with James Lovelock and Gaia theory, and she's most famous for her work on symbiosis as a driving force in evolution. So I was really lucky. I met her at a book signing. I was writing hiking guides, and we became friends, and she recruited me. But to be around somebody like that was a real stroke of luck. I met her when my half solar arc sun was conjunct my Saturn. So yeah, she was a very intelligent woman, and very sharply focused. But she said, "Hey, if you do science, you can do astrology." And so I did my PhD thesis on astrometeorology, and I took the idea out of a book by Johannes Kepler called Tertium Interveniens, third party intervening. And I tested the Sun-Saturn aspects with weather and came up with evidence that showed there was a correlation. As far as the cause was concerned, that was more complicated. But so I have this academic background, but there was at no point during those 3 episodes in my life was I concerned with making a living from the academic work. So I went into it with the idea, okay, this is just a good way to learn. And it was great. I learned how other people learn. I learned a lot about other subjects. I learned a lot about the social sciences. I mean, technically, my major, my master's degree says master's degree in social sciences from Montclair University, although I focused on history and history of science, and then history at Rutgers, history and philosophy, and then geosciences and biology and microbiology and climatology at UMass. So that's all that comes through in the book. You can see it, and I see a lot of the subject matter in those terms, which I think is very helpful.
Yeah, I think that's, and it's really interesting because then it allows you the ability to talk about and discuss like a wide degree of different scientific studies that have been done in some of these different fields that might even indirectly like relate to the question of astrology in some broader sense. And I want to get to that really quickly. Do you share your birth chart?
Sure.
What's your data?
7/21/48, 7:59 a.m., New Brunswick, New Jersey.
7:59. Is that from the birth certificate or is that rectified?
That's rectified. Birth certificate said 8. It's even a little bit of change in there too.
What house system do you use?
Porphyry, usually. I use the real ascendant as the cusp of the first house.
Yeah.
But you can do whatever you want.
Is it showing porphyry right now?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. There we go. So Leo rising.
Leo rising, yeah. Saturn conjunct the ascendant.
Rising Saturn conjunct the ascendant, day chart, Sun in Cancer, Mercury in Cancer, Moon in Aquarius. I'm a big fan of that placement as a fellow Aquarius moon. Venus conjunct Uranus in Gemini and Jupiter in Sag.
Yep.
Cool. All right. Sorry for that digression. I just sometimes when I'm doing interviews like to be able to document that from the person themselves, like what their birth data is as a form of data collection.
And that's now AAA data.
Yeah, exactly.
You got it from the horse's mouth.
Right. It's not like I met a guy who knew a lady who met him at a conference who, wrote it down on a napkin or something like that. So circling back, I want to talk before we move into like part 2 and part 3. I want to go back to and understand better part of what you were talking about in the first 2 chapters of the book, where you really did spend a lot of time talking about different, about the solar system, about the Earth, and different natural processes and ways in which there are different things like not just gravity, but electromagnetism that different studies have showed may influence biological life on Earth and other systems in different ways. What are some of the things that really, you could talk about in terms of that are kind of relevant in this discussion?
Well, there's a lot of study in regard to solar and lunar influences. So if you just look at biology, marine organisms in particular are going to be sensitive to lunar fluctuations, partly because it causes the tides, and the tides change, hydrostatic pressure. But there's evidence that they're responding to the light of the moon, the gravity of the moon. There's all sorts of connections there. There may be a transfer, from the gravity of the moon to the depth of the water to the phase of the moon to the amount of light that's coming through. But life is very sensitive to it.
And some of that's been observed since, ancient times about how the moon affects the tides, or how there's different marine life that's affected by the moon in different ways. Yeah.
It's an environment. One of the points I try to make, and I'm sure you've picked up on it, is that, life evolves in a spatial environment, and that's what almost everybody talks about. If you take a course on evolution, they're going to talk about things like geographic isolation, or competition from other species, or changes in the environment itself, and so on. But there's a temporal environment. I mean, there's the alternation of day and night. There's the phases of the moon, and there are all sorts of fluctuations with solar cycles and orbital cycles that modulate the weather and the climate and so on. So this is a real thing. This is a real environment. The rhythms of the temporal environment, cannot be overlooked if you're going to understand how life has evolved on this planet. And it is the case that life has internalized a lot of these movements and motions and cycles, and built structures around them. I mean, the most obvious one is that we sleep at night and, we're up during the day usually. And
Right.
we have probably about 200 or 300 other circadian rhythms running off that one. But there are lunar things and so on. Humans are, more disconnected from nature these days, so we may not show all the, consistently all the rhythms that potentially existed 200,000 years ago.
Right. But that's really important points. Your point is that life evolves not just in a spatial context, but also in a temporal context.
Yeah.
And one of the ways that looking at the temporal context that life evolves could be through different things that are going on in the celestial environment, since the celestial environment has always been one of the primary ways of measuring time or measuring temporal states or temporal movements.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I think these, especially with cycles, these are like, pegs in the flow of time, and organisms learn to recognize them and remember them, and then build structures around them.
Right.
The most obvious ones are, things like reproduction, and metabolism, things like that.
So let's go into some of that. Let's not take anything for granted in terms of the audience. Since audience, let's just pretend doesn't know anything about what we're talking about the book. What are some other instances, even not human ones, of, like you said, that phenomenon of life internalizing the sky?
Yeah, well, the classic example would be the circadian rhythm, the alternation of day and night. And there was a long debate as to whether the organisms were actually reading the light and day, or there was just some kind of natural rhythm. And I've always seen this. This was a debate that went on for a long time, and it was called the debate between the exogenous and endogenous, mechanism, circadian mechanism, the outside or inside, right? And the answer is both are going on at the same time. But what has happened is that these clocks, you could call them biological clocks, have evolved, and they've evolved separately in different organisms at different times. So it's not one that was passed on and inherited. Where in the cell you have these special clock cells, and they produce a certain protein, and when the protein gets up too high, it turns off a function, and then gradually that protein is absorbed, and when it gets too low, it turns back on. So it's a thermostat. So, from single cells on up to complex, megafauna like us, we have these cells that are basically replicating the cycle of day and night internally. And they're doing it with like a thermostat-like mechanism. And it sets a pattern. You can take somebody, they did these experiments where they would take people and put them underground for a month or longer and just leave all lights on and see what happened. And they would, what's called free run. And they would settle into a pattern that was slightly, I think, I'm not sure. I think it was slightly more, well, actually it would vary, but I think in general it wasn't exactly 24 hours. It was near that. That's why circadian means approximately, circa day, that sort of thing. So what that proved was that there was an internal mechanism that could clock this time that closely approximated, but didn't exactly equal the rotation of the Earth. And further, the fact that it didn't equal it was actually a good thing because that allowed for phase resetting once the organism is exposed to the source of the timekeeper, in this case, day and night. So that's the classic example of a structure that we all have in us, and even single cells have. And it can run with or without light, but it was obviously designed to follow the pattern of the day. And there's some cases, some studies for lunar things that are similar, but it's not clear about that. The circadian cycle is also used, particularly by plants, to predict photoperiod, the length of day versus length of night that happens seasonally. And it's so sophisticated that even organisms at the equator can do that, even with the very subtle changes that occur there. But they can do it.
And the length of day and length of night, of course, classically gets translated in astrology into something like the tropical zodiac.
Exactly. Photoperiod, is what it's called by biologists. But astrologers could say tropical zodiac. Yeah.
Yeah. So, and then one of the points you make in the book is that some of these different potential influences or ways in which some smaller organisms may be influenced by different things, not just like gravity, but I think you also mentioned the possibility of electromagnetism at a certain point, that life, so these smaller organisms, sometimes life can be sensitive to very minute changes in the environment. But then when you go up the food chain, that if like little organisms are being influenced by certain things and their behavior or certain things are being influenced by that, and then let's say like a fish are hunting and eating those things, then it's affecting the fish in a certain way, and then whatever else is like feeding on the fish and everything else, so that there's this like a chain reaction sort of effect that happens in terms of the environment or in terms of nature.
Yeah, that's true. The microorganisms get all excited, and then small fish start eating them, and then the big fish eat the small fish. Goes right up the chain there. And they all become entrained on, whatever that rhythm is. And fishermen know it as moonrise, moonset, and then also sunrise and sunset. But the fish will tend to bite more. And, it probably has something to do with the gravity of the moon stirring things up, very small microorganisms doing that. But we know that microorganisms and megafauna, are responsive to the magnetic field. You have these bacteria called magnetotactic bacteria, which are extremely common. They're all over the oceans and the lakes and whatnot. And they biomineralize these little tiny chips of magnetite, and they read the Earth's magnetic field and align themselves accordingly to find their ideal location in the mud, or in the water column. But other organisms have, birds navigate with that, and turtles and cetaceans. There's some argument about whether people have it or not, but there's been some studies that show that if you take kids out of the city blindfolded and put them in the woods, they can kind of figure out what direction, it is back home, that sort of thing.
That's a really funny study. That's one of those funny areas of science, of the things of like, we could test if there weren't like moral restrictions on certain things,
right.
But that we don't or can't, just because you can't, just round up some kids and just like let them go in the woods and see what happens.
Yeah. Yeah. And then there's every few weeks I come across some weird study. I found one just when I was getting to the end of the book there about, dogs aligning their body with the magnetic field, before they take a dump. And they point in a certain direction. So they're obviously reading the magnetic field.
Right. Or less grossly, like I think you also mentioned at one point that there's been an observation that sometimes animals will react around the time or sometimes shortly before earthquakes occur. And that there's been speculation about them reacting to different subtle things that are maybe not, that humans are not picking up, but that you start seeing in animals prior to major earthquakes happening.
Yeah, that's in China. They pay a lot of attention to that. Have used that for earthquake prediction, but it is apparently true. Other people have looked at it. The animals might sense. If there's pressure building up in a fault, they might sense some kind of electrical change. A lot of times if you get quartz in the rock, say it's granite, and there's a lot of pressure on it, it could be something that's readable by the organism. But, this all comes back to the idea that, from cells on up, life is pretty sensitive to very subtle influences. Electromagnetism is, what we're talking about now. It's all over the place, and it comes in different, cycles. And, it depends. The moon is modulating the magnetic field around the Earth. The solar wind hits the Earth's magnetic field and stiffens it up, and then the moon is going around that, and that modulates it a little bit. So there's all sorts of things that go on. There was a guy, what's his name, Zane. Anyway, he was interested in that and showed in a couple articles that were in the Mountain Astrologer years ago correlations between lunar aspects and very slight shifts in the Earth's magnetic field as recorded at certain stations.
Okay. So that's really cool. And one of the things this brings up that you mentioned in the book at one point is that even though we think of space and we conceptualize it as empty, there's actually like a lot going on out there in terms of our environment in the solar system.
Yeah, they call it plasma now. There's all sorts of particles zooming around in space. It's not as empty as people thought it was. So this is a whole area that's just beginning to be explored. Exactly what effects it has on the Earth, is another matter. Then there's always gravity, although it's kind of a weak force compared to some of the others. But the study that I did that correlated weather records with Sun-Saturn oppositions. Now, a Sun-Saturn opposition means, looking at it geocentrically, is that, we see it as the sun on one side and Saturn on the other side. From the heliocentric position, it's Sun, Earth, Saturn. So basically that is when Saturn is closest to the Earth, and it's, in the Earth's annual orbit around the sun. Anyway, so I took that. I went through a lot of other things before I got to that and decided to focus on it. And I correlated it with weather temperatures in different parts of the country and the world, really, and found that in certain sections there was a drop in temperature pretty consistently. And I would stack these over top each other like 100 years of records. So I was able to show that was pretty significant. And I did this for my PhD thesis, and the committee was, kind of impressed by it. But how do you explain it? Now, I calculated what Saturn's gravitational influence would be relative to the sun's, and Saturn's is less by 4 orders of magnitude. It's much lower than the gravitational effect of the sun. But some people have told me that was not that bad. That was something. And, you begin to wonder that, maybe these very small forces do account for something. And maybe in this case, it's the weather system that we're looking at. And what I found is the effect was very strong when Saturn and the sun were near the equinoxes. And when they're near the equinoxes, they're due east and west. And so they're at 90 degrees to the poles. And so maybe at that point, the gravity was such that it was enough to flatten the Earth's atmosphere out enough to push down a cold cell. And that would then distribute itself, as it moves south, as it was drawn, breaking down, moving towards the warmer areas. So in other words, there might be a gravitational effect here that the weather can feel. The question is, well, can organisms feel that too?
Right. Well, and before we even get there more broadly, though, you also spent a lot of time talking about how gravity from some of the larger bodies in the solar system, even though gravitational attraction drops off rapidly as distance increases, which is part of the issue with gravity as an explanatory mechanism for astrology that skeptics and astronomers commonly bring up, that the major players in the solar system in terms of the moon and the sun and potentially other planets do have gravitational influences on natural processes on Earth, like potentially like earthquakes or volcanoes or other things like that.
Yeah. Well, there have been a few studies that have come up here and there that show, planetary aspects with the sun and moon correlating with earthquakes or so. But the best evidence that we have for something like the outer planets, the other planets having to do with Earth processes is in the Milankovitch or orbital cycles. Now, you have to kind of step back and think in terms of deep time. This is what geologists and geoscientists do. A million years, it's like the equivalent to a minute in the scheme of things. But, on that kind of a scale, the planets are playing a role in modulating the shape of Earth's orbit. And this has tremendous effects. It causes ice ages, causes, huge changes in water level. You have the Mediterranean drying out like every 23,000 years, cycle of precession. Did that, 50 times or something. And there seems to be evidence that the Earth's system, which is atmosphere, hydrosphere, lithosphere, and biosphere all interacting and entangled with each other, right? That is picking up on these very, very subtle influences and at times becoming very entrained to one particular cycle. But then as that cycle breaks on, it loses that entrainment and maybe entrains on another one. So this is, I think, an interesting way to think about how life on the planet reacts to these solar system motions, that maybe it's not hooked up to one cycle all the time. Maybe it's shifting from one to the other or combinations of them.
And isn't the very center of the sun and Jupiter somewhere like just outside of the sun due to how massive Jupiter is in terms of its gravitational influence?
Well, the barycenter of the solar system is outside the sun sometimes, yeah. And Jupiter does have a lot to do with it, but so do the other planets.
Okay. So that seems relevant just in terms of our solar system, in terms of the gravitational influences. And then you're also talking about things like the solar wind or solar flares and other like background radiation that's happening at different points.
Yeah, there's a lot going on. I'm glad you brought this up because the truth is that the planets are interacting on the sun so much that they yank it out of the center of the solar system. And that, this is also a way that exoplanets have been discovered. That, this is common. Other stars, they're wobbling, they're moving around. So on the basis of that, they postulate where a planet is located relative to the sun. So the planets do modulate the sun. And in turn, the sun is, the sun's activity is modulated. There's a point where the sun is actually orbiting around the barycenter, the center of mass of the solar system. And there's a couple points where it kind of makes a quick jerk. It swoops around real fast. And that's, correlated with solar storms and eruptions and so on. But there are constant signals coming from the sun, the solar wind, and all sorts of high particles coming from flares and, coronal mass ejections and whatnot. So we're bathed in it. And a lot of it's rhythmic. And that rhythm is driven by the planet. So that's one explanation for at least some kinds of processes on the Earth that we could call astrology.
Right. So then that really raises a question then at a certain point of what is your definition of astrology? And depending on what definition you adopt, some of that may constitute astrology or may constitute a form of astrology. If, for example, you adopt like a common definition, like I just did a Google search for astrology, and the definition it gives is the study of the movements and relative positions of celestial bodies interpreted as having an influence on human affairs and the natural world. So that's pretty common for most definitions. That's a pretty good.
That's a good definition, yeah.
Well, one of the issues with that definition I've talked about is that actually a lot of astrologers that have followed like the synchronicity model would object to that definition because it centers on the notion that there's a celestial influence on earthly events. And if somebody's arguing that it's acausal, then that definition actually doesn't fit. However, if you did adopt that definition, and I think that is the definition that you're adopting in general, then you could say it starts getting really ambiguous at what point something is just astrology versus whatever else you want to classify that as. And I think that's kind of an interesting ambiguity in the first couple of chapters of your book.
Yeah,
in the sense of like, there's what used to be classified as natural astrology, which is just the sometimes the influence of celestial bodies on Earth and life on Earth or different things like that through natural or, let's say, scientific means. Some of that at this point is viewed as legitimate science versus there's this other area that's not viewed as legitimate science at this point. And there's a little ambiguity between the two of what constitutes astrology.
Yeah, when you get to people, it gets a little weird. But my argument is this is my definition of astrology. Let me state this first. Astrology is the subject that maps and analyzes and computes trajectories in regard to the behavior of self-organizing systems of all types. Now, self-organizing systems, this is a category, this is a class of phenomena in nature. And I'm arguing that astrology deals with them and only them and nothing else. So astrology is specifically applied to self-organizing systems. Now, a self-organizing...
What is a self-organizing system?
Yeah, I was just about to get there.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Let's start with a cell. A cell is an organic life form that is self-regulating, that is self-making. It has a boundary, but the boundary is permeable because it has to take in things like water or light and food. It slows down entropy, for sure. Life is a lot of people would argue that life is a phenomena that just slows down the breakdown of the universe, entropy.
Something that, in other words, like something that resists dying or has a self-preservation as a motivation.
Yeah, and it has a way of harnessing energy. Like, for example, in photosynthesis, you have the creation of energy from sunlight. This, a photon hits a magnesium atom in the middle of a carbon-hydrogen ring of some sort, and the electron bounces down through stages, and it's captured and stored in certain proteins, certain molecules, rather, and that they are used for energy to run the business, the organism. And those are called, organisms that do that, like algae, plants, and cyanobacteria are called autotrophs. They make their own food. They make it from solar energy. And they're chemotrophs. They can make it from chemical energy. And then the rest of the life is heterotrophs like us. We just eat the plants, or we eat the animals that eat the plants. So the energy gets transferred. But getting back to self-organizing system, you start with the cell, and then you can move up to, say, an organ, or a more a simple animal or a simple plant of some sort. And you move your way up, and the next thing you know, you've got a human being, a domesticated primate, and we are self-organizing. We have all this coordination going on. If we don't eat, we die. If we don't drink, we die. We need a certain amount of sunlight to produce vitamin D. We move around. We reproduce. We're operating on an edge, on a boundary or a gradient. We're at the edge of a gradient. And one thing can kill you. You get old, and who knows? You make it happen in an instant. You're a little tougher when you're younger. You have a little more resiliency. The organism has got a lot the ability to bounce back faster. But it's a self-organizing system. But then you have this other thing going on in the natural world. You have things like hurricanes or tornadoes on a short scale, which are kind of self-organizing for a while. A hurricane will, retain its its existence as long as it can be fed enough hot air. And a tornado as well. You need a gradient, between hot and cold air, to get these things running. On the longer scale is weather, which is driven by incoming solar radiation and also by the rotation of the Earth and wind patterns and so on. And then you step back even further and you see climatology, which is weather over millions of years. And then, or you can look at the Earth itself. The Earth has maintained pretty stable temperatures for the last 3 billion years. Why? Largely because of the way life has interacted with, the atmosphere and the oceans and the Earth, and has been able to produce organisms that draw down carbon and, keep it cold as the sun got hotter, and maintain a pH of the oceans that's favorable for life. This is the Gaia hypothesis, but the idea is that the Earth itself is the surface of the Earth, basically, where the biosphere is a self-organizing system. And we know that's very sensitive to the sun, the moon, and the planets in terms of climate cycles and so on. But now we get back to, life.
That was a really important point, though, in terms of your broader discussion in the first few chapters, is if you view the Earth as a single sort of organism in some sense, then thinking about all the different cosmic things that are happening that are influencing from outside of the Earth, that are influencing the Earth in different ways, even on a very long time scale or other times on a short time scale. You realize there's like a lot going on in our neighborhood that's influencing the Earth in different ways as a organism.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah. But I'm just trying to lay a foundation for understanding what a self-organizing system is, right? And that self-organizing systems are sensitive to their environment, including the temporal environment. Right. Okay. So this is one of the things about self-organizing systems is they can be incredibly sensitive to very small influences. Like Lorenz said, the butterfly flaps its wings in Brazil and you get a tornado in Texas. This is self-organizing systems is part of systems science, which would include chaos and complexity and cybernetics and a lot of other subjects spread out over different disciplines. But now here comes, I think, one of the toughest but yet most important parts of my argument is that humans in communication form groups, and this is another level of self-organizing system. Let's do something simple, like take the stock market. You've got millions of people hooked up to the stock market, and they've all got their own ideas. But the stock market behaves in a certain way, and anybody that does astrology knows that it does kind of respond to the planets. And people that do that entirely, in fact. But what is that? And actually, you have charts for the stock market, like the opening of the New York Stock Exchange or so on. Or let's take a nation. You have a bunch of people living in a country over a long period of time, and they develop certain characteristics. There's a thing that we call a national character. And it's remarkably stable, even though the people don't live, very long. The nation goes on, people drop off, new ones come in, but the character is fairly stable. There may have been an origin point for it. We could have a chart for that. But it's a self-organizing system. Any kind of group can produce that kind of an effect. And there are a number of writers, philosophers. In philosophy, it's called emergentism. And this has been going on for a while, for a few hundred years, I guess. People have been talking about emergence, something that comes out of a lot of people coming together, that has its own, it lives its own life, it emerges. And I think things like personality emerge from behavior and brain activity. And out of personalities combined, something else emerges, which could be, the stock market or a nation state or, a community group. And these things are also sensitive to planetary influences. And this is what astrology is studying. And it may offer some insights into how horary astrology works.
Right, because that's something you go into as you try to, you're not just trying to limit astrology to biological things with like natal astrology or to things like mundane astrology and weather forecasting or other major natural events, but also you do try to make some room at a certain point in your model for electional astrology and horary astrology.
Yeah. I talk about that a lot. And I try to explain them in the content text that I was just describing. The idea that we have these higher order self-organizing systems that emerge out of, in the case of humans, out of human mental activity and communications, and that they are self-organizing in their own way. They're not physical, but they're based on physical. They come out of physical. Whether they exist when everything physical disappears. I'm not sure about that, but what I'm drawing attention to is a subject area that has been worked on and is taken very seriously by a lot of people in philosophy and sociology and, other fields of inquiry. And I think that their ideas apply very strongly to astrology because what they're trying to describe is the nature of these higher order, self-organizing systems. Meta-cybernetic is what one author calls them. That they hold together. They have some coherence on a non-physical level. This is a broad topic, and it's not located in any one subject area. It like system science in general, it's spread all over the map.
What would be an example of something that is not a self-organizing system for contrast?
A block of wood, or a rock, or how fast a rock falls, or the flow of electricity through a wire. I mean, these physical things that physics tackle are generally not self-organizing systems. Now, physics has had a hard time tackling self-organizing systems, and they have tried, and that's where you get chaos and complexity, two subject areas that are mostly handled by physicists and mathematicians.
Okay. Just trying to get a sense for then, what in your definition would be under the purview of astrology versus what wouldn't, but I think that starts to give us a better idea of that. So you want to make room, though, for some causal, potentially pieces to astrology at the very least, and it seems like that's the large part of the purpose of part one of the book, right?
Yeah, I wanted part one to kind of set a base level. That there are things in the physical world that do correlate with astrology, and also that as when you look at the components of astrology, they basically capture what the biologists and chronobiologists and geoscientists have been finding, particularly the biologists. That photoperiod is important, and that phase is important. So that would correlate. Photoperiod would be the tropical zodiac, and phase would be aspects, and that diurnal motion, which would be houses, are important. They're found to be important in experiments. And that what the form that astrology took about 2,000 years ago captures a lot of that. And that, I think, is remarkable in itself. I haven't seen anybody else talk about it that way.
Well, that actually provides us with a good transition point into part two of the book, where you focus on the decline of astrology during the scientific revolution, or at least around that period, and what happened and why there was a decline of astrology, which put it in the state that it's in today to a certain extent over the past few centuries, where it's on the outskirts of intellectual credibility. and how that happened. And you kind of summarize what the usual narrative is surrounding that, but then you try to explain that the story surrounding it is actually more complicated than that. The reasons for astrology's decline in the especially the 16th and 17th and 18th centuries.
Yeah. The standard model, as it's taught, or as it's assumed, is that Copernicus showed that the Earth was orbiting the sun, and that killed astrology.
Right. That there was a series of discoveries during the scientific revolution, especially with respect to cosmology, which ended up displacing astrology or making it intellectually untenable. Or often there's also a separate presumption, which you also address, which is that astrology was tested scientifically during the Renaissance and found to be false or lacking. But in fact, that wasn't really true necessarily either.
Yeah. Well, yeah. First of all, there was a number of astronomical discoveries, plus Copernicus. He has a theory that the sun was, more or less the center of the solar system. But there were some discoveries, and a couple of them were novas that were determined to kind of contradict Aristotle's idea of, kind of barriers between the different spheres of the planets. And then you had Galileo with his telescope seeing things like spots on the sun and the phases of Venus. So you had a lot of these that discredited the old models of Ptolemy and Aristotle, which, when pressed, astrologers would say that this is backing up their work. But I argue that astrologers in general have not been that concerned with theory, and that astrologers are actually pretty quick to get on the Copernican bandwagon. They were promoting it out before a lot of other people were. So you really can't say that, these changes in astronomical theory were really killing astrology. They made a difference, but they weren't killing it. What killed it was probably more attacks from, the church, issues over fate and free will, and the fact that the new science as it developed was pretty good, and it was kind of a brain drain, and astrologers were left with just doing practice. In the past, it was the same guy was usually an astronomer, an astrologer, and a mathematician. And that went right through the Middle Ages pretty much. But by the Renaissance, things were changing around a lot. A lot of roles got messed up.
Let's get into all this because in the last episode, I did an episode talking with the rough title right now, I think it'll be released under, is Explaining Astrology to a Skeptic. And I was talking about it for an interview with a science journalist. And that I did talk about how in the 2nd century, Ptolemy, who was like a polymath and wrote these major academic texts on a number of different fields of natural science that became authoritative, that he kind of set the paradigm not just for astronomy in the 2nd century that lasted for over 1,000 years, but he also, as a result of being so authoritative as an astronomer, also wrote a very influential, perhaps the most influential text ever on astrology, which also then he tried to provide a conceptual rationale for astrology that fit within his cosmology, and that many subsequent people followed that for a number of centuries, so that when you did get this sudden string of discoveries that disproved part of the Aristotelian cosmology that Ptolemy based his models on, that it did suddenly throw that paradigm of how astrology worked into disarray to some extent amongst intellectuals.
Yeah, it did. Basically, Ptolemy's model was Aristotelian with a few modifications.
Which were, and by that we mean it required things like the Earth being at the center of the solar system.
Yeah.
It required perfect circular spheres that each of the planets was on, perfect circles. It required like a crystalline structure in order for the planets to transmit motion or change through the planetary spheres to Earth and other things like that.
Yeah. Yeah, it was the idea that you had this stacking of, like layers of an onion around the Earth, and each layer had its planet, and there was some unknowable prime mover in the back that would knock on the outside window, and the sound would be transmitted down to the center, which was where the Earth was, and under the orb of the moon. So it was called sublunar, and that explained astrological influences. They were coming down. Ptolemy had a couple subtle variations on that. I think Schmidt translated one, Theory of the Planets, one of the early Project Hindsight translations. You're probably familiar with it.
Right. But so the point is that, but Ptolemy wasn't the originator of astrology, and he was coming in like 2 or 3 centuries after the development of Hellenistic astrology and the form of astrology that's dominated the West over the past 2,000 years. What he did, the primary thing that he did, is he just adapted it and tried to explain it in a way that made sense within the context of the prevailing scientific paradigm of his day. Just like if, for example, there was like a polymath or a genius or like a Stephen Hawking type figure today who took astrology but then explained it and placed it within the context of modern scientific thinking and theories and made it seem plausible within the context of what we currently know about the universe. And then if 1,000 years from now, the scientific understanding of the universe changes and all of a sudden the old paradigm is thrown out, but then all of a sudden, to the extent that the astrology was attached to that paradigm, that it would accidentally then be tossed out at the same time if it was too closely connected with that paradigm.
Yeah, I think astrology was connected with that paradigm, with the Aristotelian paradigm, with some modifications that Ptolemy used, to describe astrology. And then, of course, Ptolemy had worked out the mechanics of it. He had worked out a way to calculate where the planets would be. So that gave it some authority. But when, there were errors were creeping up by people who were doing much more exacting observations like Tycho Brahe, then that was just, another nail in the coffin of the Ptolemaic model of astrology. But what I'm saying is that wasn't all that important to astrologers, the ones that were practicing. And it was important to other people outside of astrology.
Yeah, well, that's the point where I wanted to push back a little bit, because that's a really good point that you're making. And that argument makes sense, that it didn't matter to astrologers, and astrologers, as you pointed out, were at the forefront even of adopting some of those new astronomical changes. But the way in which it was important is that it did probably make it seem to intellectuals that astrology was no longer tenable, because they always continued to assume that Aristotelian model is what astrology was based on, even though astrology and the practice predated that Aristotelian model of Ptolemy from the 2nd century, that it had a long practice of study, empirical observation, and the collection of correlations between celestial movements and earthly events outside of that Aristotelian context for many centuries.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think, for the intellectuals, it meant something. The intellectuals are probably like 0.01% of the population, but that meant something to them because they were in strong positions. But the astrologers themselves, it really kind of comes to a focus with Kepler. And when you read Tertium Interveniens, which was not available until Ken Nagus translated it into English. It was not available in English. And I guess it was in the 90s that he translated it. And I've always been friends with him, the late Ken Nagus, president of the Astrological Society of Princeton, founder of it. Barry Orr is the president of it now. But you can just see Kepler at that edge between astrology and science. And, what he's saying is that, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. I mean, that's actually in the subtitle of the book. Mm-hmm. And the book is an argument, series, like a 3-way argument between a doctor, an astrologer, and Kepler. And they're going back and forth on things. And Kepler complains all the time about what a horrible job it is to work for these stupid people that, just want to use astrological information to, manipulate the world, and they don't really understand anything serious. And then, and then the scientists complain about, well, how does astrology work? And he's got this couple ideas. One of them is resonance. So you see he's kind of caught between a rock and a hard place. He likes astrology, but he doesn't see that he can't continue it as a practice. And you can come up with some theories about how it works, but you can't really nail down what it does. Meanwhile, somebody like Galileo is dropping, cannonballs from the top of the Leaning Tower of Pisa and measuring the amount of time it takes to get down there and the distance. And he comes up with a formula, and it's 100% predictable. There's no question about the accuracy of what he's doing. And Kepler himself comes up with the mathematical modeling of the solar system, real good prediction of where the planets are going to be based on elliptical orbits and knowledge like that. So I think what we see here is this kind of split between astrology as a practice and astrology that's linked to some kind of theory. But that didn't kill astrology.
Right. But one of your points in the book that was really good, and one of the points you just made, is that the mechanism for astrology that was assumed to be the case up to that point was lost during the Renaissance and the scientific revolution.
Yeah.
And nobody, partially due to a brain drain at that point, because then astrology started being kicked out of universities, and most intellectuals who up to that point, sometimes you would get these, major intellectuals who were not just astronomers or mathematicians, but also would do work sometimes in astrology, like a Kepler or a Ptolemy or what have you, that you stopped having figures like that, so that we never had another person who stepped up and was able to propose or introduce a new explanatory mechanism that explained and justified astrology. So therefore, that's the other part of the reason why it fell into decline in intellectual circles.
Yeah, I think that's true. It's too hard of a problem to solve. And John Goad tried to do it by this massive meteorological study, and he was a little too early. If he had done it like 2 centuries later, he would have had good instruments, and he would have had statistics, and he would have been able to do something with it. But in the 17th century, he didn't have that. And so he just had correlations and, kind of subjective data that he worked with. It's really an interesting piece of work, though. I've summarized it in a couple articles, and it's in the book. But, astrology at that point was unable to come up with a theory or a model or some kind of mechanism that made sense. And there are two other factors that you got to consider in the decline too. And one is the bad behavior of astrologers. So, once they got a hold of printing presses, or you worked with printers and started putting out almanacs, it became competition. It became just like the internet is now. Everybody's trying to blow their own horn as much as they can and get everyone, to go along with the program. And so you had
thinking of like Twitter and like the proliferation of social media and the ability for any astrologer or anybody calling themselves an astrologer to have a platform and to issue sometimes wild predictions about different things. That's kind of the analogy today of what you're talking about in terms of the explosion of things after the printing press, after the 15th and 16th centuries. Yeah,
I think that between, from the printing press to, for the next 100 years could be compared to like the first 30 years of the internet. It took a little bit longer, but people were just getting used to this new way of transmitting information. And the astrologers are printing almanacs with prognostications about things like floods, and they got a little carried away with that. Disasters, and every astrologer wanted to be more dramatic than the next one because that would sell more almanacs. It's kind of like tabloids. So I think that's a factor to consider too, because that cheapened the reputation of astrology, and eventually, a writer on the level of Jonathan Swift just made fun of it.
Well, yeah, and also, astrologers always have had and will always have pressure on the part of the public based on their expectations about astrologers' ability to predict the future. There is always that societal pressure on astrologers to attempt to make predictions about major events that are coming up in the future. So it was not merely sensationalism necessarily, but also I'm sure that played a role in terms of some of those predictions that were made.
Yeah, I think so. I think that those problems could be avoided with good institutions, but we don't have those. Astrology has never had good institutions. There was always, I think that astrologers for the longest time had patrons, and then suddenly they had the ability to market their own product, and it's been competitive a little bit like that all along, and that has produced some problems. And then the other issue was the issue of astrology being interpreted as deterministic, and the church's role in that. You can't have any kind of deterministic universe if you're going to have sin and so on in religion. And there was, I think, a steady, concentrated, pressure on astrology, for that reason.
That was a really interesting point to me, because that, in researching my book and my period on Hellenistic astrology and the rise and popularization of astrology in the early Roman Empire, and then the decline of astrology in the later Roman Empire that coincides with the rise of Christianity, and how that conflict between astrology and Christianity primarily had to do with a theological or philosophical problem of fate and free will, because astrology became so much associated with fate that ran into conflict with Christianity, that put free will and choice as a major tenet of its theology. But a major point that you make actually at one point in passing in these chapters in the middle of the book, this very large section that I thought was really interesting and compelling, was not just that being an issue with astrology always having this tension with the church, because that had been going on for over 1,000 years by the time of the 16th and 17th centuries, but it was the rise of humanism and how that also, ironically, from a different direction, also emphasized free will, and how that ran into potential conflict with astrology was kind of an interesting point, because that was something that was a little bit new at that time.
Yeah, that fed into it. The rise of humanism, it really explains a lot about the Renaissance, the emphasis on the human being. I mean, this is, I look at it as the rise of, intense anthropomorphism, anthropocentrism. That the human is, man is the measure of all things. You got the Leonardo da Vinci drawing and all that. Just this incredible focus on people, and how people have their own choice and their free will, and people can almost be like gods and so on. And then you get the, Pico della Mirandola attacking astrology. He was like one of the great humanists of the period, and wrote this massive attack on astrology. And that was taken very seriously. I think that played a big role in the decline of astrology. A lot of people read it and took it seriously. And, I account for, look, I'm frozen again on the screen for some strange reason. Oh, I got freed up.
Yeah. The humanism and the idea that like man is like the pinnacle of nature in some sense.
Crown of creation.
Right. So
Jefferson Airplane.
So you do start getting some major pushback from astrology in this period from people like Pico, that wrote one of the most comprehensive criticisms and attacks on astrology ever. And that I was actually a few pages that I really liked in your book was this table that showed the classic anti-astrology arguments summarized, and then how astrologers have responded to those arguments, or how they've dismissed them in pretty straightforward ways. But that was like one of my favorite parts of the book, was just that 3-page table, I think.
Yeah, good.
Let me see if I can't pull that up on the screen right now. I might put it up later, but let me see if I can find it really quickly, because some of your responses were great, and that actually would make, I've been meaning to do an episode on that topic for a while, about some of the classical objections to astrology, and that would make a whole separate podcast episode. But so you just contrast Carneades' arguments, where he says, you summarize saying precise observations of the heavens are impossible, and then the response of the astrologers you say is, observations must be done carefully. Better technology improves observations. Or you say Carneades says people born at the same time have different destinies. And the astrologers say people born at the same time, born under different life circumstances, but they will experience similar events at the same time. So you just keep going back and forth, and it's really nice summary, because that eventually gets into the Renaissance and some of the arguments that came up against astrology at that point.
Yeah, I thought that was a good way to do it, because they did come up over and over again in different forms. And just a little summary there. But Pico used all those, and he had some of his own. He went on and on. It was, it's. I don't think that it's entirely translated into English, but I was able to read some pieces that were translated, commentaries on it by other people. It's a big, big book.
Yeah, it's huge.
Yeah.
But I think there was somebody that was translating at one point, and I don't know what happened with that, but I think we'll eventually see it in translation one of these days. Okay, so trying to think of other factors. I mean, that led to the decline of astrology. You also mentioned like political stuff and social stuff, that astrologers are getting wrapped up in politics in Europe because they were serving as court astrologers sometimes, or because they were printing almanacs that contained predictions about political events. And sometimes
like
they were
Lilly. Yeah.
Like Lily's like taking sides in like an actual war that's going on. And sometimes when different political tides shift in different ways, that can shift against the astrologers when the party that the astrologers were supporting sort of falls out of power or what have you.
Yeah, that's what happened, with the English Revolution. Lilly was, he was an anti-royalist and, predicted all these, the battles that Cromwell was involved in. He apparently was fairly successful with those. But, after that happened, the country was a mess and a lot of people resented it. And since Lilly had taken a position, that affected his reputation to some extent. I'm not sure exactly how far that was. He seems to have been a pretty clever character and was able to relate to a lot of different people. At least he wasn't taken out and drawn and quartered or burned alive or anything. So,
yeah.
But yeah, you're right. I think that the social position of astrologers is important, and I think that with the rise of reductionist, mechanistic, and materialist science, and astrologers not having anything to do with that because they couldn't really test their subject material, given the knowledge and the means and the understanding of the time, the technical understanding. I think that the astrologers just found themselves more and more isolated from the higher levels of society, and basically, survived in the middle classes and the lower class. In the lower classes, as almanacs and, I guess, conjurers, but in the middle class as people probably like Sibley, who wrote in the 18th century, basically copying what came before him, nothing really new, but operating in that safe middle class zone, probably around London, having some clients.
Yeah, well, there continued to be some practitioners of astrology that cast natal charts or did horary charts or electional or what have you, but that it wasn't operating in some of the same like higher level intellectual spheres as previously with figures like Kepler or Ptolemy or what have you.
Oh yeah.
So that seems really important to me, though. Something I was learning about recently, that even the development of statistics and averages of things like that, and averages not really happening until somewhat late around the time of this period, but that the important point that it wasn't that astrology was tested statistically during that time using the type of scientific testing that we would think of as common nowadays, and that's how astrology was disproven in the 16th or 17th century. But instead, there was primarily this like paradigm shift that made astrology seem not plausible anymore.
Yeah.
That combined with a bunch of other social, political, and other factors.
And religious
factors. Well, and or non-religious in some instances, if we're talking about humanism.
Right.
So that was the point at which both that astrology declined. And that's really what you spend like several chapters talking about, is how complex that was just in and of itself.
Yeah. It was a lot of things going on. It was a perfect storm, and knocked astrology right out of its higher position. But it was always under attack from religion. There was always that problem. And I think that astrology had previously been in a fairly precarious position, because in order to maintain the practice, you had to have a patron of some sort. So in the patronage system, you're pretty much at the mercy of who you're working for. Some of it was going on in the institutions of the time, which were the church institutions. But of course, they didn't want to have a lot of people astrology there. So you did have some work on astrometeorology and natural astrology, maybe a little bit of medical. But the institutions make a big difference. They can keep something going.
Sure. Yeah. So there's this decline of astrology, but in intellectual circles, it falls out of the universities, where there used to be chairs for astrology, and it was integrated into other fields like medicine. But then I think by the end of the 17th and 18th centuries, all of that's disappeared from universities. But the astrology, the practice of astrology persists among individual practitioners who are just focusing on casting charts and interpreting them for clients, and passing on part of that tradition in terms of the practice without necessarily trying to do like high level theorizing about how it works and how it integrates into modern cosmology and science and other things like that.
Yeah, it was middle class. I mean, people that probably had other jobs. They were hobbyists, antiquarians, interested in this sort of thing. And mostly in England. I don't know a lot about how much astrology survived elsewhere, but everything I'd read said that not very much. It was, in France, it was kind of banned from the scientific circles. And there were probably astrologers in France and Italy and Germany, but not a lot. England seems to be the place where it really, kept going, kept being passed along. But like you say, it was, not theoretical. It was practice. I mean, that's what we inherited. And, here in the, 20th and 21st century, we inherited astrology strictly as a middle-class practice.
Yeah, as a practice and also as part of a collective empirical tradition. That's actually something you emphasize a lot that I thought was a really interesting point in the book, that astrology has, going back to Mesopotamian times, a long empirical tradition that started with the collection of observing observations between celestial movements and earthly events, and then writing those down on clay tablets and passing that down from generation to generation as observations about these correlations that they were seeing. And that's when we say like the practice is part of what we mean by the practice, or what you mean by the practice is that sort of collective or cumulative empirical tradition to a certain extent of astrology.
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it. Yeah. And, it's been pretty consistent. I mean, this is, a great argument. I bring this up to people. I say, Saturn's been pretty much the same thing for the last 3,000 years, if not longer. I mean, it's cold and hard. It's associated with the temperaments and so on. But astrology has just become more sophisticated in terms of its understanding of the primary symbols, and that's an empirical project. That's a result of centuries of observations. And of course, everything takes place in the context of the culture that you're in, but they have accumulated, and we're the beneficiaries of it.
Right. And I think one of the points you make at one point is that you can collect, not just in astrology, but in other scientific fields, like collect a series of observations about a correlation and the outcome of something that you're seeing, of something that's happening in nature, without necessarily knowing the mechanism of why that's happening or how that's happening.
Yeah.
That eventually you want to get to that point ideally, but it's not necessary in all instances for the practice to persist by just observing the sort of outcome of that process, or just collecting the correlations themselves.
Yeah, I think that, that science can't be limited to reductionism. That, the naturalist does exactly what you described. He's looking at what's going on and trying to, make sense of it. If it gives rise to a theory, all the better, but it doesn't have to. You're still observing the behavior. Suppose you're studying, squirrels in your backyard, like I do. You watch them carefully and you learn to, distinguish between the individuals and, follow their behavior and so on. That's doing science. That's a kind of science. I mean, really, biology was doing that for a long time, right? And the biologists were so excited when they finally got a good theory of evolution, and they got even more excited when they got some kind of molecular model.
Right. Well, I mean, and didn't evolution eventually develop? Darwin developed the theory of evolution eventually after a long series of like observations and of field studies of going out into the field and studying things.
Yeah, I mean, one of the big, characters in biology is Carl Linnaeus. Started classifying organisms, genus and species. So classification precedes all this other science. So it's a science. I'm very clear in this book that I think when people say follow the science, I say to myself, what the hell are they talking about? They should be saying, follow the reductionist, materialistic, mechanistic, deterministic science. That's what they're saying. They don't even know what they're saying. They just call it the science, but science is bigger than that. There's just a lot of people that are, they want to make everything physics. Science is a collaborative, democratic method, a collection of methods to make knowledge about the natural world. That's, I think, a good definition. You just can't make something up and say it's true. I mean, you could do that in religion, but you can't do that in science. If you say, the sky is blue, you have to get some confirmation from other people. That makes it democratic. Science is a sophisticated body of knowledge that is greater than simple know-how, which is more like trial and error. And you have know-how. You can fix a car, but you don't know how the car works. Science, takes that further and analyzes every step and tries to understand how the car works.
Yeah, well, that you meant drive a car, I think.
Fix a car.
Because that's.
As I was speaking, I was imagining myself under one of my old Chevys or Volkswagens taking it apart.
Okay. Well, I was thinking of an analogy that I use sometimes, that astrologers are like practitioners or people that know how to operate a technology or an advanced technology. Like, I know how to use a microwave, for example, to like heat up a burrito without necessarily knowing fully the mechanics of like how a microwave works or being able to construct one. If I had to build one from scratch, it's possible to know how to use or operate a technology without necessarily knowing fully what the theoretical like principles are underlying it. Sure,
we could apply that to the study of electricity. It's a lot. People don't exactly what electricity is. Movement of electrons and so on. It's an ongoing process, but they figured out what to do with it pretty quickly. You got electric light bulbs and motors and things like that, but they didn't really know what they were dealing with. They were dealing with a force of some sort.
Or even like gravity, for example. Like, people used gravity to their advantage in different ways prior to Newton coming along and explaining a theory or coming up with a theory for what gravity is.
Yeah, you make a water wheel, it runs on gravity, or a clock, pendulum of some sort. Yeah, of course. So I have a very broad definition of science, and I don't think science should be limited to, taking part of nature into your laboratory and dissecting it into pieces, and then coming up with a mathematical equation to explain it and say this is the only definition of reality. I mean, even to get to that place, you have to do a lot of other things. As long as it's done in a way that's democratic, you have, you try to get a good consensus, and it's done logically and you follow a method, that's science. And I think astrology, is like a lot of these other subjects, like electricity that I mentioned, where we're dealing with we're dealing with something that's not easily explained in the context of current knowledge. There are ideas about it, which I talk about all through the book, but you still know how to work with it. You still know what to do with it, and there's a lot of evolution of technique. So I think that's one of the good things that's going on in astrology now is you have a lot of experimentation with techniques from the ancient world and modern world and other parts of the world, India and so on, and people are testing these things out. Presumably, the testing will get more rigorous over time. I think right now the field of astrology is in kind of a both an exploratory phase, and it's also in a phase where it's trying to gather itself together to be a little bit more coherent and create some institutions.
All right, we're back from a break. So we've kind of covered what you cover in the middle of the book, which is the decline of astrology, and now we've started getting into part 3 of the book, where you focus on the history of the revival of astrology in modern times, some of the conflicts that have happened, especially with the skeptical and the scientific communities, as astrology has tried to reestablish itself as a respectable intellectual discipline. And then eventually you get into some reflections, some personal life reflections about your experience as an astrologer over the course of your life, as well as some statements about the future and how you think astrology is going to go over the course of the next century. Yep. So I was surprised by, like I said, as somebody that didn't come into the astrological field until I started studying astrology in 1999, and I was studying at Kepler in the mid 2000s, actually, partially with you. You're one of my teachers at Kepler College. I studied, but I wasn't around for some of the things that happened with the attempts to study astrology scientifically in the 1960s and 70s and 80s. And it was interesting hearing in some instances about your firsthand experience with some of these tests, where you were actually like one of the astrologers that participated in some of the studies that were done during that time period.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah. Sean Carlson, that study. That was a terrible study. And yet it's because it was published in Nature, it's taken very seriously. These guys, they test one thing. In this case, they tested astrologers' ability to connect charts with personality profiles that were created by the California Personality Inventory. And I point out, that's like comparing apples to oranges. It's not really fair. And people tell me that he did the statistics wrong. I never checked them out. I don't even know if I know enough to be able to find those differences. But other people that seem to know have said that, yeah, that was flawed as well. But in any case, it got out there as kind of a nail in the coffin thing. It really showed that astrologers don't know what they're talking about.
Right. One of the ones that was more interesting was the earlier study, the Vernon Clark studies, which was astrologers matching charts to clients, which was initially positive for astrology. But one of the observations that you made, I think, in terms of the issues with astrologers replicating studies like that, is the lack of standardization in the field and the skill of practitioners kind of being all over the place because of the lack of standardization and the distinctions between like who's a skilled astrologer versus who's not being somewhat ambiguous sometimes.
To say the least, hey, anybody can be an astrologer today. It's a free for all, and I point out in several places that, if you're a good hustler, you can get somewhere. I have Mars and Libra conjunct Neptune, so I've never really had the hustling instinct. I had other things going on in my mind, but I just stuck with it. I have persistence, and so I did manage to make a living at it for a long time. But it's a chaotic situation when you have people in a field and there's no way to know who knows what. If you're an outsider, you come to astrology, well, who should I have? So they usually go by word of mouth, and that can work pretty well. But today, with the ease of advertising, back in before pre-internet, advertising was hard to do. You had to print up newsletters. I used to have a newsletter I would send out by mail, and that sort of thing. You had to do that, but today it's very easy, and so it's even more a case of somebody having good PR skills and a little bit of knowledge of astrology could develop a bigger clientele than somebody who's very competent but is not comfortable blowing their own horn. So that's, I think, a big problem in astrology today, is that there's no way for the outside world to make sense of what the heck is going on.
Right. And I think you said in one of the studies, they just kind of like collected astrologers from one local astrology group or something like that.
Yeah.
And then that was supposed to be sufficient in terms of testing astrology, even though just collecting astrologers from a random astrology group is not necessarily going to net like the highest or most skilled or even proficient practitioners from the field.
Oh yeah, that one in particular, I think it was in Ohio or something, Indiana or something like that. But this guy from a college goes out and he finds some nice people that have an astrology club, which I had never heard of. Gives them a psychological test, probably similar to the one that was in Nature, the Sean Carlson one, and then takes the results and shows that nothing happened. It's evidence that astrology doesn't work. And then that gets published in a psychological journal, and people, refer to it, and it gets around, and it's ridiculous. A lot of that has happened. There are some very bad, horrible studies of astrology that have gotten published in decent journals because there's no, they call them peer-reviewed, but nobody's really qualified to do, to peer review an astrology article in those magazines. Probably not.
Right, because most scientists that would be on a peer-reviewed board of a scientific magazine not only wouldn't have any background in astrology or sufficient background, but they'd also have like an ideological sort of bias against it, which is one of the other issues that's a common recurring and major thing, and something I was reflecting on recently, because I feel like in my experience that the skeptical community was much more vibrant and much more, maybe vibrant isn't the right term, but bigger, like in the mid 2000s when I was first in the field for like the first decade. And I feel like that's declined over the course of the past decade. But in the period of time we're talking about was probably the time when the skeptical community was perhaps the most like organized and motivated and I don't know if militant is the right term, but there was just a lot more going on. I think it might be. Yeah, in the 1970s and 80s. And just in terms of what that was like operating as an astrologer during that time, but not just that, but that with people like that there tends to be an ideological motivation or implicit assumption that astrology can't work, and therefore just cosmologically or philosophically or there's a preconception that it's not possible that this works. So therefore, any attempts to try to validate it need to be stopped and need to be dismissed in some way, even when sometimes that runs counter to even like sort of realistic or acceptable like scientific practices. And that was the big issue with the Gauquelin studies and the different attempts to replicate the Mars effect.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that if you're, in science and you've gone through all the education and you basically have settled on a reductionist, physicist kind of perspective, astrology makes no sense in that context, none whatsoever. And if you accept astrology, it means you got to throw overboard everything that you've learned, or at least a lot of it. And I have had people in physics and some in philosophy that I have friends in those fields, and that's what they've told me. They've said that, if I buy astrology, then I got a real problem, because that's going to interfere with everything that I've come to, conclude is true and real.
Because there's no known mechanism about how astrology would work.
Yeah, and also the implications of it, for a person, for example. I mean, the astrology of the person is the real touchy area. Nobody cares about the astrology of the weather or the climate, or at least not as much. But
yeah, I mean, I just have it's hard a little bit understanding because it's, oftentimes that presumption, that strong presumption, it's based on whatever limited understanding the person has about what astrology is to begin with, because it usually doesn't extend to even knowing about or being familiar with like birth charts, or that astrology is more than just sun sign astrology or something like that. So there's this perception or sort of prejudice against it intellectually before you even get to the point of like that there's more to it than just what the person is familiar with or what a person from the general public would be familiar with.
Yeah, they have a knee-jerk reaction. Lynn Margulis, who I worked for, and she's the one that, was my advisor for my PhD program. She, the only thing she knew about astrology was that there were a lot of Scorpios in her family, like way more than there should have been. But she never really, she was so busy with her own things. She never had time to learn anything about it. But she and I were very good friends. And she used to test out astrology on some of her, peers in science. And she would mention that, she has a graduate student that's studying astrology. And she would say that, one guy almost had a heart attack. She described him as just going, off the deep end. Like he almost started shouting at her. And that almost everybody, said, well, that's a lot of, crap. Come on, what's the matter with this, But there were a couple of them that popped up out of the woodwork that had been studying astrology on their own. They just weren't going to open their mouth about it. And I was at a conference, a science conference in Italy one time. And one of the guys there came to me after, at a break and said, I heard from Lynn that, you study astrology. I don't tell anybody that, but I do as well. And I have some of my own ideas. Do you want to hear them? So he had the guy was a paleontologist, but he had this whole little thing on the side that he was doing with astrology. And it was interesting. It was kind of his own flavor of it. He got a lot of ideas from mainstream, astrology, but started developing, and I can't recall offhand exactly what some of those were, but that was fascinating to me that there was, at least two people that I ran into in the sciences that kept their mouths shut and were exploring astrology on their own, but most of them had knee-jerk reactions, don't even bring it up.
Yeah, that's going to be one of the most interesting things from a social standpoint is that because astrology in intellectual circles is viewed as, like Tarnas usually says, the gold standard of pseudoscience, or like the paradigm of what a pseudoscience is supposed to be about, that there are a number of people, there's a surprising amount of people that will not be open about their either interest in or practice of astrology to people around them or people in their social circles or especially their work circles due to a fear of major repercussions, negative repercussions, if they were to like divulge that to people openly, that they could suffer, career setbacks or, issues with religious family members or just a number of different things like that.
Oh yeah, I know quite a few people who are in business, work for corporations or teach at universities that I talk to. They ask me questions about astrology, or I in the past give a presentation somewhere, and they come up to me afterwards and they just say, "Yeah, I do it. I bought a copy of Solar Fire and I'm exploring it, and try out all these different things, and but I don't tell anybody that I work with about it."
Right. I mean, I think every practicing astrologer knows that and has that experience, because as soon as you start being a consulting astrologer on a long enough timeline, you see people from all walks of life and many different professions and many different stratas of society and everything else who have an interest in astrology, and you realize that they're not always, can't always be open about that in public.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I've had that problem too. I've early on, when I really got seriously involved in astrology, I was in my early 20s, I guess. And even people in my family had a little bit of a problem with it. That came up for a while. And my uncle, who was Sagittarius with Gemini moon, could handle any position, defended me. He says, "Hey, leave him alone. He's, he's not stupid. He's learning about something. What do you guys know about it?" And I thought that was great. He was a good uncle. But there were other times where I was in group situations where people would start attacking astrology, and I got good enough to be able to stop it, put them down, and that was a bad thing. I got in trouble a few times for that. Like I was being some kind of meanie, putting somebody else down that was trying to put me down. because in the larger scheme of things, astrology couldn't possibly be real. It was just some kind of like hobby that Bruce was having, was involved with. So I had to deal with it a lot and early on. And then after that, I just didn't care. I didn't care what people thought. And if somebody didn't like astrology, the hell with them.
Mm. Yeah. I mean, so that's, on the one hand, you get the increasing, the scientific sort of orthodoxy being against astrology and that becoming increasingly militant through the rise of scientific skepticism in the 70s and 80s. And then on the other side of society and culture, you also still have centuries of pushback from religious sectors of society and the religious objections to astrology. So it's within this context that like some of the attempts to even try to validate astrology scientifically are happening in the 20th century. And the primary one, or the one that was the most promising, was the Gauquelin studies. And that's something that you spend time talking about at a few different points during the course of the book, and that it seems like you still think is relevant and needs to be part of the discussion today.
Oh, yeah. I think that it was the most sustained, complex, and sophisticated astrological study so far, because he spent his whole life, and his wife was working with him, Michel and Francois Gauquelin, and it was rigorous. I mean, that study holds up to any great scientific study. I mean, there's a lot of garbage out there that's done and that allows the FDA to make a drug legal. But Gauquelin's is just as tough and tight, and more so than most of these. And it's been challenged. If you interviewed Ken Irving, you know all about it. I mean, he's the one who's, the Tenacious Mars Effect, right, is the name of the book, right?
Yeah.
Earl and Irving.
I guess I'm bringing it up because there was a lot of excitement surrounding Gauquelin's work and other attempts to do studies, like scientific studies of astrology like that, where you kind of pick out one factor or a couple of factors in astrology and you try to test it scientifically. But I feel like the astrological community hit a wall in the 1980s and 1990s with some of those studies where, for different reasons, things were not going as well as had been hoped. Sometimes, occasionally through like underhanded means, like some of the replications of the Gauquelin studies that were withheld or swept under the rug initially. And it seemed like, especially starting in the 90s, there started being a lot of reflections in the community about why this was, attempts to explain it, and a sort of decline in enthusiasm, and questions especially about whether that was even an appropriate way to attempt to validate astrology, so that you get the works of people like, most notably Geoffrey Cornelius and his work, The Moment of Astrology, that tries to explain why scientific tests of that sort, statistical tests primarily, might always be doomed to failure, or might not be an appropriate way to attempt to study the phenomenon of astrology. But it seems like in your book, that's something where you don't agree with that viewpoint and the way things have gone over the past 3 decades, and that you try to push back on that to some extent.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with him in the sense that reductionism in testing astrology, is, at least initially, it's not going to get good results. So it's going to look bad for astrology, because in astrology, you're testing a self-organizing system, and self-organizing systems, or emergent systems resist quantification. They're very hard to test. So, we're working with a difficult beast here. But I think there are some openings, and it depends on refinement. Like, for example, there was the NCGR suicide study. And so they got a lot of charts of suicides, people that committed suicide, and they tried to see what was common with them, and they tried everything. They threw the kitchen sink at it, Uranian astrology, everything, and they didn't really come up with anything that was statistically significant. Now, my take on that was that, there's different suicides for different reasons. And sure enough, when I was working on this book, I came across this paper that somebody wrote on a study of suicide ideation, like the correlation between suicide and what is generating the suicide showed some statistical significance with, one set of reasons rather than another. So, to me, I don't remember the details offhand right now, but, to me, that's like a lot of sciences. You have to start refining your sample set. Gauquelin got results because he didn't take all athletes. He took athletes that were good. And then he had to find some way of saying how they were good. So they had to have, scored in major competitions or be listed in books or whatever. And that was, checked by Ertl and a number of others, and it works. So that's called extreme sampling. And so you do have to do that. There are people that are doing it.
So the point was that the phenomenon showed up in the charts of eminent athletes, not just any old athlete. But then there became a argument around what constitutes eminence and whether there's some subjective issues in terms of deciding who's eminent versus who's not.
Yeah. But that happens in doing any kind of social science. I don't think astrology's subject matter is complex, but so is psychology's, because it's almost the same. And, psychology has all the institutions and it's aligned itself with the medical field. So it's got that advantage. And so, they keep working on these personality inventories, and, mostly they're self-created. The studies there are questionable. They have as hard a time of testing their subject as astrology does, but they're not astrology. Astrology is scary to people, because it interferes with fate and free will, and because the physicists don't like it. There's a lot of prejudice towards it. So astrologers, they have to do 10 times as much work to get any kind of attention. Meanwhile, Gauquelin study stands there. It's like a giant edifice in the field of astrology. It's a big building. And they don't want to look at it. Still goes on. There's still arguments pro and con, but, I think it's pretty solid.
Right. I think I wrote down a sentence that you wrote at one point later in the book where you said, "It should be obvious by now that astrology does not lend itself to reductionism because it does not study easily reducible phenomenon."
Yeah. So self-organizing systems they're in motion. It's hard to you got to take out, you got to take one shot at it and, take one piece of it. Well, like what I did with the weather, I explained that, it traditionally is Saturn and weather. Now you got to remember that the people that were, on a little side here, the people that were doing astrometeorology were using the same techniques as the people that were looking at natal charts of people. Right?
Yeah, that gets into some complicated stuff, though, in terms of weather prediction and things like that.
But I was going to say, they all agreed that Saturn was cold, dark, damp, not good. And I took one of those, qualities, temperature. And then I got daily temperature data. And I ran it against this, in this case, as I mentioned before, the Sun-Saturn opposition. And lo and behold, I got a result that was pretty consistent.
Mm-hmm.
So that's reductionism applied to a system, but it doesn't have that much to do with free will, so it's not earth-shattering.
Yeah, well, and I was thinking, like, the Gauquelin studies are a better example of that, to the extent that you're talking about isolating one factor, which is like Mars and what sector of the chart it's in, essentially, and whether it's especially rising or culminating at the midheaven.
Yeah.
But you're focusing on just that one factor in isolation of everything else, which is hard because that's not usually how astrologers operate when looking at charts, but instead they're looking at the totality of the chart and how the alignments of the planets it sort of alter the expression of different planets based on how each of the planets in the chart is aligned relative to each other.
Yeah, astrology is synthesis. You're blending things, and it's done intuitively like an artist does. That's why the practice of astrology is not a science, it's an art. But astrology is a subject, and it has a component, like other subjects do, that could be called theory and research, and they could be separate or they could be working together or whatever, but that could produce a science. That's what has happened with psychology.
Yeah,
and
that
medicine.
seems one of your primary contentions is that you think that someday astrology will be validated as a science.
Yeah. They may not, people really didn't understand the mechanisms of evolution. When Darwin, publishes, he knew that there was variation, but he didn't know how the variation was produced, his theory of evolution. That came later. Ironically, it was coming at the same time Gregor Mendel was working out inheritance with his studies on peas, but it really wasn't until another 50 years where that got integrated with evolution, and then it became neo-Darwinism. So, similar things could happen with astrology. You can build up some kind of model that works pretty well and then start filling in the details later as you get to it.
Yeah, but in terms of response to that last question, that was kind of a non-committal yes. And I think based on the book, you actually have a much more strongly affirmative answer, personal view on that you do strongly believe that astrology will be validated scientifically at some point, as opposed to I'm saying astrologers such as Cornelius who say no, that's actually not going to happen because there's something about the intrinsic nature of astrology that makes that not possible.
Yeah, I don't agree with him at all. There's a lot. He says a lot of interesting things. I read the book. I got a lot out of it, but I disagree. I think that calling it divination is easy and it solves the problem for the time being. But I think that there's a lot of reality to astrology. You can see it working, and it's affecting other self-organizing systems like weather. And I've tested it myself. And Gauquelin tested natal astrology by noting, significant correlations in the diurnal cycle of the planets, which we call the houses in astrology. Of course, he called them Gauquelin sectors, and used 12, 18, and 36 or something like that, 24. He used different sectors of, depending on what the study was. But I think that as time goes on and astrology begins to build better institutions, or institutions in the first place. What do we have? A few schools and a few organizations. It's about it, right? Yeah. So maybe some billionaire will come along and, start something up. Who knows? I don't know. And if you read carefully, I'm talking in terms of centuries, really. I'm not saying this is going to happen, in the next 20 years, right?
Yeah, you spend the entire last chapter, it was an interesting contrast because early in the book, you said about some of the diciness with making predictions, but you spend large part of the last chapter actually making some predictions about the future trajectory of astrology and the astrological community, just based on your observations of what actually seemed like, when I was reading it, a very interesting and perceptive set of observations about the astrological community and the type of people in it, and a sort of realistic projection, although sometimes idyllic or best case scenario projection about where astrology could end up in the future and its place in society based on certain things that astrologers might do now.
Yeah, I'm not, let me be clear and say I'm not making, and that I'm not making an astrological prediction about where astrology is going to be.
Right.
I'm just making, some comments and observations, maybe supported by some ideas that I've gotten from studying history. And I do see astrology as a legitimate subject that's about 300 or 400 years behind the other subjects. Maybe not quite that. Maybe 300 is about right. And so it has not gone through its significant revolution like biology did or geology did or physics. These subjects have gone through these big revolutions and they've become changed and organized. And I think that conditions have just not been ripe for astrology, because astrology is the subject that studies, analyzes, and maps self-organizing systems. And self-organizing systems are relatively recently recognized as a distinct phenomena. Systems that have emergent properties, these are not easily reducible. So that's why astrology is behind, one of the reasons why astrology is behind the times on, having its own revolution that would allow it to be better organized as a subject. And I also want to make perfectly clear that I'm not concerned with astrology being accepted by the rest of the world. Oh, look, I froze again. How about that? I have the transiting Saturn on my Mercury now, so I guess my image, video image, just freezes from time to time.
It's fine. It'll go away in a moment.
Yeah, it'll go away. You just wait long enough with Saturn, right? There we go. We're back moving again. But that, over time, astrology, if it improves and gets serious about itself and gets organized, will just become recognized. It doesn't have to prove itself to some authority. It just has to get tighter and better. And you can't have a free-for-all, and you can't have a situation in astrology where getting astrologers to cooperate is like herding cats. And the reason why is because in order to make a living at astrology, you have to have a little business. You have to be an entrepreneur, a sole proprietor. And you have to do a lot of things. Now you have to know the internet, and you got to be a broadcaster, and you have to publish. You have to do all these things. I mean, I've had to do them. I feel I was fortunate to live a lot of my life before the internet. I don't know. Maybe I would see it different if I was born later, but I see the internet as like a bit of a nightmare.
I don't know. I could see you being a big hit on TikTok right now. Possibly might consider that at some point. It'd be good.
Well, maybe. I'm spending most of my time just trying to keep my health going.
Yeah.
Lead a ritualistic daily routine of little exercises and so on, to just keep the whole system going. Don't have a lot extra. I felt sad. I sold my old skis the other day. I hadn't used them in a long time. Sorry to see that go. But anyway, yeah, I think that, getting back to the subject, I think that if astrology internally improves itself, that will make such a difference. The subject will be better recognized by others, but who cares? It'll make it on its own. It'll show itself that it can be a subject and it can contribute to the conversation. Right. Astrology is not really contributing now to the world in any significant way, and I think it should. It has a lot to say, a lot to offer.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I definitely, in the last chapter of the book, you really focus, while you spend a good deal of time talking about external pressures and issues that have kept astrology relegated to the fringes of society for the most part, especially in intellectual circles. You also spend a good deal of time talking about like some of the internal issues in the astrological community and areas where we kind of need to clean up our act and get it together as a community in order to take astrology into the next level or into the next era.
Yeah. Well, astrology operates as an outsider bubble in a bubble. It's a bubble culture. It has its own rules and regulations, and when you get in those situations, it's really a survival crisis of a collective, and you help yourself along, and everybody's an astrologer. I'm an astrologer. What does that mean? You decided you're an astrologer, right?
Right.
Or I'm a professional astrologer. I make some money. How much money? You make a living at it, or is it part-time? Is your spouse, covering you, or what? It's just not clear. It's a free-for-all. And you can go on and on for a while with a free-for-all, but it doesn't really work in the long run. And so, in the meanwhile, it's a cultural bubble. It's isolated, and it's still recovering from the, centuries of attacks from the church and ostracism by, the physicists and, the skeptics and so on. It's in a bad shape. And so it needs some work, needs some focus, some agreements on how best to proceed to develop astrology as a subject that can contribute to the global conversation on, what is nature and what is life, what is, how do things work? And
yeah. So one of your points was that because astrology fell out of the universities, and because it's a largely unregulated field at this point, while there was a push in the 80s and 90s to do some certifications of astrology in order to set some standards, that there needs to be more of a push towards that, because otherwise there's no way to distinguish between who's a good practitioner of astrology or one that is either ethical or skilled or other well educated,
Yeah.
other things like that, versus somebody who just started studying astrology a week ago and started calling themselves an astrologer right away or something like that.
Yeah, I think that there's no perfect solution. Let me just be clear about that. There's no perfect solution, but education and testing is probably the best option available, and other subjects have done that. So when you go to see a doctor, you want to see a doctor that went to med school. And although the medical field produces certified doctors, not all of them are that good. There's a range of difference, but at least it prevents the quacks from holding a high position. It's a sorting out mechanism. It's an establishment of some kind of standards. I'm saying that some set of standards is better than none, for multiple reasons, one of which is better for the astrological community because it will allow institutions to grow, which will then allow astrology to progress and develop itself. I don't believe astrology is perfect as it is. I think astrology is a work in progress.
Right, but that something like that, while even though if we had better certification and better standards in astrology, that just like any other field or other disciplines, there's going to be a range of different practitioners in terms of their level of skill at their job or what they do, as well as their ethics or other things like that. It would at least give some baseline for when people try to do studies like the Vernon Clark studies, where they're trying to get together a group of skilled practitioners of astrology and have them match charts in a controlled setting. Because in a test like that, you want to know and be able to have some sort of distinction between, who's a practitioner of this subject or a skilled practitioner versus who's not.
Yeah, I think if you're doing like a Vernon Clark type study now, what you would do is you would select, your the people you were testing to have, say, some level of astrological certification plus, some number of years of practice. And then you'd be more likely than not to get people that knew what they were talking about.
Yeah, I mean, that would increase certainly the things. There's definitely other things you could maybe add on top of that I think I would like to see in terms of standardization if astrologers were to start engaging in tests like that again. That actually raises a issue that I've been having recently, which I'm kind of nervous about, which is going back to that observation I've made where I feel like in the past decade, the skeptic community has kind of fallen apart and we've seen a kind of decline in the leadership, sometimes due to the loss of major leaders like James Randi, who were at the center of things for several decades, or in other instances through the sidelining of some of those figures due to social issues and different in politics and things like that. But I'm a little nervous that the current generation of astrologers who came in this huge influx or this huge wave into the community over the past few years has so little experience dealing with the more militant sort of variety of scientific skepticism, that they're going to be a little caught off guard and a little underprepared for how to deal with some of those arguments compared to people back in the 80s and 90s, where that was a more common thing that you had to deal with more frequently.
Maybe. I don't know for sure because I haven't really been all that active in astrology in the last 10 or 20 years, really. I've kind of stayed, kept one foot in it, but I was doing other things and had my own health problems. But I think it should be part of any kind of astrological education, an understanding of criticisms of astrology. That should be a
Right.
course, a required course, in my opinion.
Yeah, for sure. Or
Yeah.
doing, research to understand some of the different studies that have been done in the past and some of the, pros and cons for those studies. Like when it comes to like the Gauquelin studies or the Vernon Clark trials
Yeah.
or other things like that, like having done maybe like a literature review of some of that stuff.
Yeah, and people have written things about it. There was an article called "Debunking the Debunkers," and then that stirred them all up. Valerie Vaughn was the author of that, and there's a history of arguing between astrologers and the skeptics, and if somebody could put all that together, that would be a great book right there, a great document, and very useful for people new in astrology, so that they would understand what the criticisms are and what the responses are.
I mean, is arguing with skeptics fundamentally productive? Because I feel like
No, it isn't.
I feel like there's a tendency sometimes early in one's studies of astrology to have that motivation to feel to like want to defend it more and to get into some of those arguments, but then eventually later on, sometimes not always, people mellow out or realize that sometimes it's not productive or that it's a waste of time, and maybe don't engage in that as much.
It's a waste of time to argue with these people most of the time. But I think what would be great is a collection of arguments between skeptics and astrologers in a book, but written by somebody who has, a sociologist, for example, or a psychologist who would really be able to analyze where these people are coming from and what the argument means in a larger context, various arguments, maybe historical connections to them and so on. Yeah, that would be interesting. I mean, I think, that's the kind of thing that astrologers would benefit from, being able to step out of the bubble and see, okay, there's an argument going on with this one group, and we know that it's just a waste of time to argue with them because, they have a positivist philosophy and they're not going to really budge on it. But let's look at it in perspective. What is it? What does it say about our culture? What does it say about, who's in charge and who's making definitions? And what does it say about astrology's strengths and weaknesses? These are the kinds of things that we could, learn from. The astrological community could learn from.
Yeah, I mean, I think the ability to look at astrology critically has always been one of the major hallmarks of some of the greatest figures in the history of astrology, the greatest astrologers, and the ones who made the greatest contributions to the understanding of the theory and philosophy and the way that astrology integrates with science and the natural world. And that's often a tension within those figures, like the Ptolemy type figures or the Kepler figures, where on the one hand, they can sometimes be highly critical of certain parts of the astrological tradition that they view as not valid or that doesn't work or is superstitious stuff that they want to reject and set aside, versus the other parts of astrology that they view as valid or useful or effective in some ways and that they want to retain. And that's where you get Kepler's famous, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater phrase.
Yeah. Also, Francis Bacon had a good deal to say on astrology and what should be thrown at and what shouldn't. But people have done this. People have talked about it, people in science, but nobody's really done it. The distinction between astrology theory and astrology as a practice, comes into play here. The practice, follows its own path, just like, medicine does. A lot is determined, on the fly through, experiences. And then it kind of gets back to the research area and they test it out and find out what might really be going on. But we don't have that in astrology. We just have practice. Mm-hmm. And it moves at its own pace. But what we need is to have some way of organizing what's being learned, and capturing it. These days we have some really good practitioners, and eventually they write a book and you learn something about it.
Yeah, that used to be part of the role of the astrological organizations, and I feel like that's something that's changed recently. That's been issue with the community, is that the astrological organizations are struggling to find relevance and to stay relevant in contemporary times. And one of the things that they did that was a service previously, like prior to the internet, that was unique and was a very important feature of the community, was have journals and publications, so that there was some sort of centralized, almost repository for publishing astrological research or for having discussions in the community. But that's one of the things that with the rise of the internet that's almost become less relevant or useful, and it's one of the ways that the organizations are kind of struggling to reinvent themselves in the early 21st century.
I don't know if I would agree with that. NCGR, for example, has continuously published a journal. They had a magazine and a journal, Geocosmic Journal, and what was the other one? There was two of them that came out. Now it's just down to one a year, and they publish articles. Right. And some of them are quite good. Scott Silverman edited one on, the outer, newly discovered bodies, hyperbelt objects and things like that. And I thought it was pretty good. And people wrote some pretty good articles about it, talked about their experience. The problem is that if you're a practitioner, you don't have the time and probably not the knowledge to do, a first-class reductionist science experiment on astrology and publish it. So the organizations, even though they may have been formed around the idea of doing that, International Society for Astrological Research, National Council for Geocosmic Research, that's what they wanted to do. But the reality is nobody's got the time or the knowledge to do it. It's just too hard to do without some kind of support. I was worked at the university for a long time, and I know what that's about. You go begging to, the National Science Foundation or somebody else to get money, and then you get $100,000. Then half of that goes to the university, and then now you've got $50,000 to work for a year on your project, or however long it might be. That's how you get stuff done. We don't have anything like that in astrology.
Yeah, well, I guess that's part of my point, is that the astrological organizations are nonprofits that are largely run by unpaid volunteers,
right,
whose numbers have declined drastically over the course of the past few decades. And the contributions to those journals are just from whatever's available. And most
membership.
of the time,
they're from membership, largely.
Yeah, from membership. But then the membership is largely just practitioners who are not necessarily researchers in the sense of these aren't primarily like scientific journals at this point.
No, they can't be. Because
right,
the astrologers don't know how to do reductionist science, and the subject's too hard to test. And there's no support for it. Give somebody $100,000, that really knows astrology, and they might be able to come up with a good test. And it might take them a couple of years, and then they make $50,000 a year.
And I think that was what part of your point at one point about conferences as well, which is that oftentimes it's more like market factors that drive the types of discussions that happen at conferences, because people are more interested, astrologers or astrology enthusiasts are more interested in learning techniques that they can use to apply to their own birth chart or to the charts of clients than they are typically in hearing about, tests of astrology or statistical analysis of astrology, and lectures like that tend to be far less, to attract less, and therefore to not be featured as much. And that's also a major shift, I feel like, in the astrological community in the past few decades.
Yeah. Astrology is market-driven largely, and it spills into the conferences. You have to have, a topic that's going to draw people, because then that brings in more people to the conference, and that allows the conference committee to pay for the expenses of having a trade show and all that. Right. That's just how it works right now. That's how it's going. I think that the organizations have had their challenges. They still seem to be going fairly well. They have certification programs. NCGR has an old certification program that is separate from NCGR now that I'm involved with. That's one of my feet in astrology is in that. It's called Professional Astrologers Alliance. And, there's an effort to update the exams, and it's geared off Ken Negus's vision of a 4-year college program in astrology. So level 1, there's an exam, and that it assumes that you have, it's your freshman year. And there are equivalencies. Like if you go through the Kepler program and you get their certificate, you automatically qualify for levels 1, 2, and 3. It's like you have your freshman, sophomore, and junior year completed. And then the senior year is more like, you do your own report. And, there are different requirements for that. But it's something, the organizations are doing something. And I think without them, astrology would be, would be more impoverished. They play a role, and so do the schools, Kepler College and IAA, and there are a few others. And they are the organizations and the schools are right now all the institutions that they comprise the institutions that astrology has. They're not much, and they don't, and they're mostly volunteers, you point out, but they're what we got.
Yeah, they're what we got for sure. I'm curious how that's going to grow and evolve, and what steps could be taken to improve some of those things. And I do feel like there's a struggle to maintain relevancy of them to a certain extent amongst the younger generation of astrologers who hasn't seen as much about why they should become involved in those things or what the benefit or advantage is. So that's something that's kind of going on as a generational thing right now, where it was more necessary 30 years ago. Like those mailing lists, for example, that the astrological organizations put out, that's where you heard about what was going on in the community. But nowadays you hear what's going on in the community more so through social media and things like that. So that's why I'm saying there's sometimes an attempt to reinvent themselves or to understand what their relevancy can be in the modern period, where some of those things have shifted a little bit.
Yeah, I think that the organizations which were formed in a time where there was no internet, need to adjust to the internet. I mean, that's what happens. If you're born in it, my son is 35 years old. He knows exactly how to work in that world. I'm older. I've figured it out enough to get by, but I'm, no expert. If I had to market myself as an astrologer right now, I would have to do a lot of work. I would have to, put a lot into it. So it is, right. It's a different medium, and the organizations, are using it. They're not using it, entirely. I think that there are other factors involved too. If you're a libertarian, you don't really want a group. You just kind of want to operate on your own. And I think that the organizations represent a kind of, a social responsibility aspect. Not that they all deliver it, but it comes out of a group model. Like we're all in it together. So again, it does reinforce the astrological bubble in some ways. But it also provides a community, where information can be shared, that's focused around something. Those two organizations, ESAR and NCGR, they were originally focused around research, as you point out. And now the research is too hard to do, and nobody's qualified to do it. So what are they? They're a social group of some sort. They're a social group that brings together amateurs, people who love the subject, and some professionals. And, I think you're absolutely right. There is a search for relevance and meaning as time goes on. We'll see how that unfolds.
Yeah, I mean, the fact that both of them have research in their titles, but that research and what that means is not the same as when they were set up in the 1970s and 80s, I think is a good example of that shift. One thing I wanted to make sure I ask you about is a term and a phrase that you use like multiple times throughout the book that I always associate with you, and I always thought it was like one of the best phrases ever, is for a birth chart, you call it a time slice, or for an astrological chart, you call it a time slice.
It is.
What does that mean, or could you expand on that? Yeah,
well, first of all, I don't like the use of the word horoscope for a chart, because I don't think it's quite that accurate. As I understand it, it means like view of the hour, right?
Means like hour marker.
Hour marker. So it probably refer more to the ascendant, I would think.
Yeah, it originally meant the ascendant in the first house.
In the history of trigonometry, the challenge of calculating the ascendant goes down as like one of the biggest things ever. I mean, that's what they were going for. They were going for that ascendant, that horoscope. Anyway, I don't think I think the word's been ruined by all these newspaper columns and so on. So I prefer to call it a birth chart. Mm-hmm. But the birth chart itself is a photograph of the sky. And, if you're in the northern hemisphere, you're looking south. East is to your left and west is to your right. It's a shot. It's it's a time
like
slice.
Snapshot.
It's a snapshot or a time slice, because that's what a snapshot is. And it's a term that's used in the sciences. In geoscience, I've heard it used there, but I think there are a few other places. But it makes the most sense to me. I see it as one of the two primary techniques that the subject of astrology employs in analyzing the self-organizing systems that are its subject matter, the time slice and the cycle.
Did you get it from geoscience? Is that where you picked it up from?
I may have. I'm trying to think where else I may have gotten it from. Philosophy. I'm not sure.
Because that actually makes sense, because I'm thinking of like sometimes when you drive through the mountains here in Denver, like a highway that they've cut through a mountain, sometimes you'll drive through and on the side you'll just see the different layers of sediment, and you realize that you're seeing stuff that built up over hundreds and thousands and millions of years, but that one of those little layers is what you're talking about, is a time slice.
Yeah, you see that in marine cores and ice cores, where you're looking for the history of the atmosphere and the oceans, so you have a core and you slice it at some point, and since you're measuring time and what was going on in those times, you can call it a time slice. But it's a good question. I've been using it for a long time, and I probably got it from geosciences, but I'm not positive. I may have run across it in some other. Anyway, it stuck with me. I just thought it made the most sense. This is what we're doing. As astrologers, we're analyzing a time slice calculated for a moment of that, a tipping point of some sort, a transition point, a bifurcation is the word I use in the book often. But we also use cycles. And in the past in astrology, those were called revolutions. Cycles of Jupiter and Saturn and things like that. It's kind of a broad use for the term revolution, wouldn't you say? Because, you can use, but it's not you're not talking about time slices or charts then with revolutions, except when something crosses the vernal equinox.
Yeah, a revolution. It's just going back to the original meaning of that, which is a return to something, or for a cycle to be completed, right, and for something to come back to where it started.
Yeah, so it's like it's kind of like a cycles thing. So I would say astrology analyzes time slices and cycles. And those are the two main approaches.
And I love that. And there's something really important there about the phrasing it as a time slice that gets to the heart of sort of the title of your book, what is the nature of astrology? But when you conceptualize let's just say a birth chart for the sake of argument, instead of generalizing it to any astrological chart, but you're taking something where time is always flowing, and you have like a start point, like point A, and then eventually it flows to point B. But it's like a continuous process that never stops moving, and the planets always keep moving in their orbits and their cycles and their movements through the solar system. But then at the moment of a birth chart, you freeze that and you take a snapshot of that moment in time and where the planets are placed relative to each other in their orbits. And there's something about that slice of time then that becomes important for describing the nature of what happened in that moment, as well as its future, essentially. Yeah,
because the time slice shows where you are amongst all the various cycles that are going on, all the revolutions. Right? And so, the astrology has developed all sorts of techniques to unpack information stored that way in the time slice.
Right.
So aspects, like applying and separating, that would be like one obvious approach.
Mm-hmm. So that, and that's fundamental to your conceptualization of the nature of astrology and what it is, that it's the study of those time slices within the context of self-organizing systems like humans, but also other self-organizing systems on Earth.
Yeah. There could be, non-human animals. You could do charts for gorillas.
Yeah, I think you actually cited a study at some point that somebody had done about dogs.
And right.
Different types of dogs that had different measurable, not just their personalities in a in a weird sense, or in like a human sense, but in the terms of like their like different dogs have more aggressive personalities or different things like that, and that somebody had tried to study that.
Yeah, the breeders write down the personalities of the dogs, because the buyers want to know that. And what's her name? Fouchot. It's a French hyphenated name. I can't think of it off the top of my head right now, but she wrote a number of scientific papers that related astrology to biology, and they're very good. And she did one with the dogs, and it's basically a replication of Gauquelin, except using dogs.
Mm. So
because it tracks the diurnal cycle, correlating with the personality of the dogs.
So the point there maybe that would be like, in your view, that there's something universal about astrology and how it works, that it doesn't just have to be applied to humans, even though it's most commonly done in that context through birth charts, but that astrological charts or time slices can be applied to other living entities that have, a life cycle or like a temporal component to their existence.
Yeah, and things that are not living, things like decisions, or electional astrologies. You compute your own time slice, when you want to make a move. But there is a tendency in astrology to be very anthropocentric, and I think that's not good. In general, I think that's a bad thing. I think that humans got to get out of that. That's the equivalent of like the Earth is in the center of the solar system. It's like humans are in the center of the solar system.
The application of that to electional and horary astrology was the part that I was like the most uncertain about in terms of the extension of some of the causal arguments to astrology and how that would work, because that's the point where astrology starts to be much more abstract and symbolic and sort of removed from the more like biological considerations that might be more relevant when we're talking about like humans or dogs or what have you.
Yeah, well, the subject of higher order systems, self-organizing systems, which would include personality, the mind, group behaviors, and so on, it's pretty new. We don't know a lot about it. And I try to explain some of it in the last chapter, and then show how that information could be very relevant to explaining horary and electional astrology. But, I mentioned a number of authors there, and, if somebody was really interested, they could see that, papers are being published on it. The philosophers talk about emergence, and, so do scientists. It's a new area. I think I mentioned somewhere that I think it's as radical as quantum mechanics, except that it just hasn't gained traction because it's spread out among a whole bunch of disciplines.
Yeah, one point that you started getting to that I thought was really interesting that might be at the core of it and could perhaps be developed more at some point is it almost seemed like you were saying at one point that anything that has any self-organizing system that has a bifurcation at some point, that to the extent that you can cast a chart or a time slice for that moment of bifurcation, or that moment where something in its existence meets a fork in the road where it can go one direction or another, that the analysis of that temporal moment in time is anything that experiences that you can use astrology to analyze that, both that temporal moment in time as well as project it out into the future. Yeah.
You could see its trajectory. Yeah, it's almost reminiscent of Lorenz, the butterfly effect guy. He found out that if he put all these this information about weather, to model it, and he found that if he changed the starting point, the results were completely different. So it's, to me, that's like a kind of an analogy to what happens in astrology. You have this starting point. In the case of people, it's the transition from water breathing to air breathing, and separation from the mothership. So it's a bifurcation point, a big shift and change. You look at that time slice, and then you got a good sense of where things are going. But could it have been at a different time and things would be different?
Yeah. So that, to me, that gets into some really important things, because it starts to become more about the study of astrology starts to become more about the nature of time, or there's something there that starts getting to the mechanism underlying astrology being something much broader that has to do with time, the nature of time, and the role that time plays in our experience of reality or in nature, that's hard to articulate, but it was something you were starting to point to there that seemed very important towards the end of the book.
Yeah, I really, there's so many unanswered questions, but yeah, there's, what is really going on in astrology is going to require a lot more knowledge than we have right now about things like time and about things like internal time. I bring up ideas about imprinting, in cases of, human development, the planet's timing windows of imprint vulnerability, and basically encoding certain kind of patterns, and that they relate to the planets, some of the inner planets. I don't say that that's an explanation for all of astrology, but I think that's kind of where things might be going. I do state pretty clearly that I think that a lot of astrology might be explainable, maybe not, maybe not right now. There needs to be more work done in some of the other sciences, and that this is, the present moment in some ways is like poor John Goad trying to do his study of astrometeorology in the middle of the 17th century and not having access to reliable thermometers and barometers and, weather vanes. And actually had that, hygrometers, all sorts of, instrumentation. I mean, modern science is based on instrumentation, which produces units that you can do reductionist science with. He also didn't have statistics. He just had, he had averages, more or less, that sort of thing. So I think astrology today is at a similar point. We just don't have the science. We have the beginnings, I think, of the science of self-organizing systems. We have the beginnings of that, but we don't have enough. But I think that astrology as a field should pay more attention to that and should define itself as a subject. And, whether it doesn't have the institutional power to fund research and theory, it should just be more aware of it. Whether the internet is going to be able to bring that to enough people and or enough people are going to get it, I don't know. But, I think astrology will survive as a subject, but I think it could do a lot better if there was a little more awareness that it's not limited to practice.
Yeah, I mean, I think after reading your book, I think it's up there on the level of Cosmos and Psyche in terms of important discussions about the nature of astrology that will be very impactful on the next generation of astrologers. And it doesn't have the same aim as Cosmos and Psyche in that your book is not trying to prove astrology or necessarily demonstrate its validity through case studies or something like that, or examples, but it's trying to explain astrology and where it's at now and how it got there, how it got here, and to present that to a more intellectual audience in order to give people a sort of like heads up about the subject and what the deal is with it, as well as some statements about where it might head in the future and how the trajectory of astrology might be improved so that the place of astrology might be improved in society at some point in the future. Yeah,
that's just about it. Yeah, I think it's a call to break out of the bubble and look around. Stick your head out of the bubble and look around, like that old medieval woodcut, Renaissance woodcut.
Right. So that on the one hand, that's an encouragement for people outside of the astrological community to stick their head outside of the bubble and see that there might be something to astrology. But then on the other side, it's also an encouragement for astrologers to stick their head outside of the bubble of the astrological community and to try to engage in other fields of research and other disciplines that might be helpful to astrology or might be interrelated and might be necessary to learn and specialize in order to get anywhere closer to either creating a grand unified system of astrology again that integrates with other sciences, or in terms of getting closer to trying demonstrating some sort of validity of astrology to the public.
Yeah, raising the level of the field, raising the level of understanding, the caliber of the practitioner, the general understanding of where astrology has been, where it's at, and where it might go. That's what I hope for. I invested a lot of my life in astrology. It's one of my major identity points. And so I hope to see it progress.
Yeah, well, I definitely, I can already see and anticipate that works like this and like Cosmos and Psyche together will probably be the works that are necessary in order to appeal to and explain astrology and to sort of make the case for astrology to somebody in the future that's going to come along at some point, just like at times in the past, like when we get like a Ptolemy figure or a Kepler figure who are just like these polymaths that try to take astrology and integrate it with the contemporary views about how the cosmos works and creates a new paradigm then that lasts for several centuries at that point and makes astrology acceptable again by giving it a cosmological framework. And I have a pretty good feeling that your book will be one of the ones on the bookshelf of the person who comes along at some point in the future and does that.
Well, that's nice to think about. I wouldn't be surprised if somebody from outside of astrology, comes into the field at some point and really does something with it. Because I've seen a few things like this. I've seen some people in meteorology, for example, really apply some pretty sophisticated, complex astrological techniques to weather formations. Stuff that I would never think about because I don't know meteorology. But, somebody from psychology, for example, could come into the field and revolutionize it. And we have the software now. That's one thing that is wonderful. Having the software to do astrology. Wow, I remember the days when I was cranking it out on a slide rule.
Right. Yeah. Back in the old days with the cuneiform tablets and stuff.
Yeah. Well, actually, I summarized the whole, what I learned about calculating charts in a book. Did you ever see that book that I wrote, Astrological Chart Calculations?
I did. That was a very heavy, that's actually surprisingly more heavy read than some of the science chapters of this book.
I think I sold 100 copies. But,
Okay.
Margaret, Cahill from Wessex Astrologer also puts it out now. But that's kind of a summary of what I learned before computers.
Yeah. Well, one of the last things I want to say was just that I was very influenced by Jeffrey Cornelius's argument for the past 15, 20 years or so, as well as I got into ancient astrology and studied Hellenistic astrology and understood the pre-Ptolemaic views of astrology that were more based on the mechanism of astrology working through signs and omens and something approximating synchronicity, that I've been very taken by that argument and very taken by the notion that astrology, the mechanism underlying astrology, is a causal for a number of years. But I've had this thing in the back of my head for a number of years where I also realized that traditionally astrology was associated with Mercury. And there's many different areas when it comes to Mercury, where Mercury traditionally always like straddles the divide between two different seemingly irreconcilable positions, like, night and day, masculine and feminine, or what have you. And oftentimes with astrology, you run into a similar issue where sometimes it's when you have what looks like an either or situation, sometimes it ends up being both. And one of the biggest things that your book kind of impressed on me was that while I've thought about astrology entirely and conceptualized it in a causal framework, definitely the first few chapters have opened up the question that maybe one shouldn't completely reject the notion that there could ever be any sort of causal mechanisms to astrology that could play some sort of role in the overall reason why astrology works or the reason why it does what it does, and that doesn't have to be fundamentally incompatible with the other view necessarily.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things I'm trying to do in the book is, emphasize the importance of natural astrology, right?
Right.
Which would include astrometeorology, it would include mundane astrology and all that. And, pay a little bit more attention to that and see that there are causal mechanisms for it. And then, look at the human situation as, a particular case in nature and, try to understand that as best we can using, what's known about self-organizing systems, higher order self-organizing systems, which some people call meta-cybernetic, more complicated, both physical and mental at the same time, and learn what we can learn. But you may have also caught my drift that I don't make any claims for one thing or the other. I'm just kind of this harmonious observer that's going along in my life. And, I make some statements about things like calling astrology divination. I don't think is helpful.
Yeah, I mean, I do think you strongly reject the conceptualization of astrology as divination, and you also see
all of astrology as divination. I mean, and divination. You can call a lot of things, like a good guess is kind of divination, or maybe election predictions is divination by, for some people, they make a call and they don't use, statistics on it.
Well, no, I mean, divination is actually a very specific class of practices that often take a random or chance-like allotment of something in nature.
Yeah, throw the dice.
Yeah, throw the dice, throw the tarot cards, or throw the coins in the I Ching. But then, contrary to how that would work out if you kept doing that over and over again on a long enough timeline, and statistically it would always just be 50-50, that you take the singular moment of that chance like allotment and you interpret it as having symbolic significance, and in that moment it actually does, even though if you were to take it outside of that moment statistically, like, it wouldn't necessarily work out if you just kept doing it over and over again, because it's something about the nature of chance having a real symbolic import in that moment of the inquiry, if the inquiry has a charge or something important to it. And the argument is that that's what that's what birth charts are, that's what horary charts are, and everything else, because they're connected with this notion of a chance-like allotment. So that's contrary, though, to the notion that astrology is based on regularly recurring causal celestial forces that can be tested and analyzed statistically, like through the Gauquelin studies and stuff like that. And that's really, in the future, sort of post your work, is going to be the debate that astrologers are going to have, is between those two different camps, because they're a little bit in conflict with each other. And while that debate's shifted more on the divinatory side over the past 30 years, your book reminds me that different astrologers have different views on that, and then it's not necessarily always 100% per se.
Well, I think that, labeling astrology as divination and labeling astrology as nothing more than a practice, I think, is the easy way out. I mean, that's the simple answer. I think it's a little bit more complicated, and I'm not saying that I have the answer to it. I mean, I've experimented with different kinds of divination systems. I published a book on one based on ancient Mexican, divination and astrology. I used to, I'd be playing with my band and a lot. I used to play every weekend, and I would have astro dice, and I would entertain people on breaks with that. I'd have them think of a question, roll the dice, and I would give them an answer, and I was like pretty accurate on it. And then I decided to put together a deck of business cards. So I collected all these business cards from people, and I would carry that along with me, and I would do I basically use a tarot-like pattern. I would read the business cards, and I would get good results from it. So I know that stuff goes on, and I think what it has to do with is some of these, emergent, self-organizing systems out of human minds, and this is an area that has just not been fully researched. So basically, what I'm saying is that even divination at this point is a candidate for a much better explanation for what it is.
So you're not fundamentally opposed to the concept of divination, the practice, because you've practiced it yourself to some extent in the past, but you think
I can douse, I can do that stuff.
But you think it's a sort of like a cop-out when it comes to just saying that that's all astrology is.
Yeah.
And that's the purpose of some of your first two chapters, in talking about different ways in which the celestial influences do influence Earth and its biosphere and life on Earth to a certain extent?
Yeah, well, there's plenty of evidence behind that. Yeah, I mean, life has evolved in a temporal environment, and the temporal environment is driven by geophysical and astronomical, realities. The moon is swinging around, and the sun is doing its thing, and the length of day is changing, and the length, we're bombarded with this information. It's baked in.
Right. So, but the question will be, and this is what will be debated between astrologers, is that is that the same as, or is there a jump getting from there to saying that, Mars in the seventh house in a day chart, or let's say Saturn in a night chart in the seventh house will correlate with somebody that gets, a divorce or something at the age of 30 at their Saturn return or something like that. But there starts being other, what seem like more symbolic considerations in astrology that sometimes the more naturalistic or causal explanations, it's harder to see how those would apply or how that would make sense.
Well, it is hard to see that. I mean, I'm suggesting, like a perspective, looking at these higher order self-organizing systems, which may be hypersensitive to all sorts of little things that go on. And there may be other forces yet to be discovered. We just don't know. Mm-hmm. All I'm saying is that, there are many ways to look at astrology, and just like, reducing it to divination, I think is a lazy way out. That's not to diminish anything that, Jeffrey Cornelius has done, because he's written a lot of really good things and looked at ancient astrology, and I liked his book. I just think that there may be a lot more to divination than we think.
Yeah, I think the point is also just that there shouldn't be any blanket rejection of that there could be a mechanism just because a mechanism is not currently known, and that people perhaps need to keep an open mind about that possibility, especially if the phenomenon of astrology itself keeps pointing to these correlations between celestial movements and earthly events.
Yeah, I think that, at any given point in history, we don't know everything. I just read, Foucault's book, Madness and Civilization. I found it at the dump the other day. And, he's this French structuralist, postmodernist writer. But it was good because he basically showed how the societal understanding of madness has changed drastically over the centuries. And only recently are we starting to get it together. And of course, even right now, the psychologists are still trying to work out what a personality disorder is. So, if you look at that and how recently our understanding of mental illness and that sort has, come into focus, you got to look at astrology and say, oh, come on, we got a long way to go.
Right. And I think you actually cite a couple of instances in the past in science where there's been a phenomenon that was discovered or identified before and recognized before the mechanism for it was known.
Yeah, like electricity.
Okay. Could you explain that a little bit?
Or heat. I think that was the example I gave. Yeah. They didn't know what heat was. And they, it took years, decades before it was, reduced to an understanding and a formula.
Right.
It just wasn't known what it was. But you could do a lot with heat. You can get a stove going and boil water and make a steam engine.
Right, and all of those things were done before eventually developing like a scientific understanding of the processes behind heat and how to control and recreate. Well, I mean, even before then, people were controlling and manipulating things like fires and were able to use it before it was like known exactly like what a fire is or how it works.
Yeah, knowledge progresses. It's not static. There's a lot of first you start with know-how on something like that, and then maybe you eventually build a theory and you model it. Other things start with theory first and then are discovered. So knowledge is acquiring knowledge is a time-consuming process, but I think it's the way to go.
Yeah, and that's your primary. This is primarily also by the end of the book. It seems like an encouraging or asking astrologers to take that next step beyond the practice to start exploring and trying to formulate a theory of how astrology works and to try to find that.
Yeah, to look at other fields. When you're isolated in a bubble, you don't look to anything else. But that's not saying everybody in astrology is like that. I know people in astrology that are involved in other fields of research as well. But that's where cross-fertilization is what you really need to grow something like astrology as a subject.
That makes sense.
So anyway, I just think that the search for a simplistic answer right now doesn't contribute to growth. It solves a problem pretty quickly and then you're done with it. But I think that, as you point out, my first 2 chapters are, just throwing all this reality up on the table and saying, well, what do we do with this?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and the book itself ends up becoming partially like your personal reflections and research about after a lifetime worth of research and work in the field of astrology. And I think it's a really major achievement from that standpoint for sure, and was really brilliant. And yeah, I'm really glad that you wrote it. So thanks for writing this book.
Well, thank you, Chris. I appreciate that.
Yeah. Well, I look forward to, so the title of the book is, it's titled The Nature of Astrology, History, Philosophy, and the Science of Self-Organizing Systems. It's published by Inner Traditions, which lately has started getting into publishing astrology books, and they're just doing an amazing job publishing a ton of really great books lately. I think I've interviewed like 2 other authors. I interviewed Eric Perdue last year, who did a translation of Agrippa that was published through them. What are your, so people can find it in bookstores, they can order it online on Amazon or anywhere else.
We can order directly from Inner Traditions. I think they give a discount.
Okay, good to know. So just Google Inner Traditions or go to, looks like their website is innertraditions.com.
Yeah.
What's next for you, or what you're going to publish any other like 500-page tomes, or what are your plans for the future?
I got to get my body. I got to survive. I have had a couple of accidents and 2 spinal surgeries. I have a cervical myelopathy, and there's a lot that you have to do to maintain it. And kind of slows you down a lot.
Yeah, I mean, I noticed your Saturn is at 22. Leo on the ascendant to 24 Leo, and your moon, like mine, is in Aquarius. So you've been going through you've been going through a Saturn opposition recently, and Saturn opposite your ascendant. And before that, starting in 2020, it was like going over your moon. So hopefully that upcoming ingress of Saturn into Pisces and finally getting out of Aquarius after the past 3 years will help.
Maybe, but you get older, and then you have these slowly degenerating situations. To bring in some Uranian astrology, I have the Sun square to Hades, which is deterioration. So I have, basically a very slowly deteriorating situation with my spinal cord that, needs to be slowed down. And one of the effects is just being dizzy, having what's called cervical dizziness. So anyway, you could look at it in my chart, you could see that health problems are an issue, and they particularly get, with Saturn, they come on when you're older, and
Yeah. And you mentioned Uranian astrology is one of your other specialties, and you've also done work on Mesoamerican astrology or Mayan astrology.
Well, Uranian astrology I got into very early, and I had Gary Kristen and I kind of got that going, and we knew Hans Nigeman. Gary brought me over. Two of us went over his house one time, and we saw him at conferences. And so I learned a lot of Uranian early on. Got into ancient astrology early with A.H. Blackwell, back when just pretty much Manilius and Ptolemy and a few fragments was just about all that was known, so I got into that. And then I got interested in Mesoamerican because here was an opportunity to understand how astrology might have originated in an entirely different culture. And so I got into that, wrote on that extensively. But meanwhile, just practiced kind of a mixture of standard astrology, with a few ideas from here and there, old ideas, new ideas, Uranian ideas, and built a practice around it.
Well, and it seems like that's giving you a great perspective and amount of depth, especially when you start analyzing the astrological community and the different trends and different things in it in the final chapters of the book that are very perceptive, and just your analysis of those was very on point in terms of things you said about the community and your sort of assessment of the community, as well as your predictions about current trends and where some of that might take us in the future.
Yeah. Well, I hope people get to read it and get something out of it. It's to answer your last question. I mean, this was a big job, and the pandemic helped in a way. The quarantine helped me get it done. But at this point, I'm not sure where to go. I may write some technical papers, but I don't think I could ever do anything like this again. I wouldn't want to.
Yeah,
but some scientific papers. I have a few on ResearchGate and academia.edu. You ever go to those places? People put their papers up there. Yeah.
I mean, academia has been amazing over the past decade for making research more accessible than it used to be.
I think I have one of your papers linked in one of my Kepler courses. I have an online course called Symmetry in Astrology. And I think I have a paper that you wrote on the parts, the lots.
Okay. Yeah. The theoretical rationale for those.
Did I get it from academia? Did you have it up there? Or where did I get that from? Maybe your website.
I've posted my papers there on academia. I have an account, so that is probably where you got it.
So I linked it, and so my students have to read it. So thank you.
Okay. Well, I've got a
it was book. Public, so I just took it, the link to it.
That's fine. I've got a book as well.
I know your book. Yeah, very good book. Thank you for doing that. Somebody had to do it.
Yeah, well, and I know I need to wrap this up, but that was actually an interesting point, is that you also expressed some reservations about astrological fundamentalism, and why you appreciate the looking back into the sources, and especially the historical reconstruction of astrology, which is something you've taken advantage of to a certain extent in your book, and a huge chunk of it. You also warn against too much fundamentalism and seem kind of nervous about that trend.
Well, I think that there could be a little bit too much of certain things. I mean, there are people that tend to get into, say, Hindu Vedic astrology, right? And then it becomes their whole world. People get into Hellenistic astrology, and it becomes 100% of their work. I mean, it's okay if you want to do that, but I see it as a subcategory, and there could be. Well, I always think of, my friend Bob Zoller. We used to go camping, hiking together, and he was always saying, we would have all these discussions. He would say, "Oh, the old ways are the good ways,"
right?
And he would do that. And I think that you learn from the past, but it's it's like, do we want to practice Hippocratic and Galenic medicine in its pure form? I don't think so. Well, there's a lot to be learned from it, but. I think that ancient astrology, all kinds of astrology, just needs a lot more testing and, sorting out and so on. How well, the perfections work. It's a good question, what you do, and I think it's a great thing, is try to, flesh out what these people were doing. Because we have to know what they were doing before we can decide whether this, the technique works as well and how it is to be employed. So somebody's got to do that.
Yeah, for sure. One of the things, actually, it's funny about my history with you is I got into ancient astrology and studying Hellenistic astrology just a semester before I started taking your courses back at Kepler. So unfortunately, it was probably one of my regrets in my educational history, is I got super into and did that initial passion of the convert type thing by the time I was studying with you, so that I would sometimes be at Kepler, reading those translations of the ancient texts instead of focusing on some of the more modern texts that we had moved into at that point, where we were talking about things like secondary progressions or solar arcs or things like that. And I remember some distinct instances like that at symposiums when I was taking some of your classes. So I'm happy in a way that with this book that things have come full circle. And I feel like I've come back around to the position of seeing the value of both ancient and modern astrology, and this book has brought me full circle on some other philosophical issues to a certain extent. So I'm happy that how things sort of work out like that in the end.
Yeah, I remember you and George and I were teaching a course on progressions and solar arcs and transits, and you were in and out of it. I think, you asked for permission to, sit in. I think it was, Nick was giving lectures in the other room or something on the ancient astrology. Nick and Rob.
Oh yeah, on the history of astrology.
Yeah, we trusted you. We just said, yeah, go ahead, do what you want to do.
Yeah, I'm sorry about that. I apologize. I mean, part of the issue was just that I had studied modern astrology for 4 or 5 years.
You seemed to know what you were doing. I mean, we grilled you. You seemed to know what you were doing. So, all right, fine.
Yeah. But go ahead.
We weren't going to bust your chops. I mean, if you didn't know it, the subject matter, we wouldn't have let you do it.
For sure. Yeah. But you were very gracious about it as I was going through that like early stage of being fascinated about traditional astrology. Yeah. And that was the beauty of that stage of Kepler College was, having all these just great lectures and different things at the time of astrologers teaching astrology at a very high level. And I've always felt like I was just super lucky to be the beneficiary of that from people like you and from Rob Hand and Demetra George and Nick Campion and everyone else.
Yeah. Well, you were at the perfect time to get immersed in ancient astrology. As I mentioned before, I was interested in it, 20 or 30 years earlier. There just wasn't that much known.
Right.
And then when the three Roberts got together and started, translating it, I mean, that made all the difference. And you were right there when that was happening.
Yeah. Well,
yeah,
and then I went and lived there, like at Project Hindsight for 2 years. That's why I was sort of caught up in all of that. But
great opportunity, really,
Yeah, but I still, drawing from my influence of learning modern astrology and different things from you at Kepler, knew not to go full like astrological fundamentalism, and that's why I sort of ended my book on the note that I did. That it's really important that even though I'm encouraging people to go back and studying ancient astrology, and that there's something valuable to be learned from the past, that astrology is always in a constant state of flux and change, and that doesn't mean that we shouldn't synthesize and integrate it with some of the great insights and developments in the future.
Yeah.
And I think that's a lot of what you've focused on in your work and tried to show the best pieces of is doing a sort of like high level modern astrology as an intellectual.
Yeah, in a way. I mean, you got to know your roots. You have to understand where astrology came from. And I credit people digging into the history of astrology with giving astrology the foundation that it had lacked. Was being owned by the historians and the historians of science, and they weren't very friendly. So, this is a very good thing. But in regard to astrological fundamentalism, to me, the coincidence of Project Hindsight, the rise of fundamentalism, taking over the Republican Party, and my own interest in Mesoamerican astrology, they were all at the same time. That's kind of what I'm referring to. I did notice that was happening, that there was this kind of, maybe it had something to do with, the outer planets moving into different signs. Pluto went through Sagittarius and then through Capricorn as a lot of this was happening, but particularly in Sagittarius. You had this rise of fundamentalism, and it seemed to have a little effect on astrology as well, and I was part of that. I mean, there was Project Hindsight was going on at exactly the same time as I was digging into Mesoamerican astrology. Unfortunately, I couldn't communicate in this exactly the same way, and I didn't have anybody. No one else was really doing it, but it was the same kind of thing.
That's really interesting because also the Vedic focus on Indian astrology in the West.
And the Indian came in on that too, yeah.
That was all what I saw in retrospect, or what I've studied, and I did a paper on this at one point. I think it was in the NCGR journal, was how that coincides with the Uranus-Neptune conjunction in 1992-93. And if you project that back, every time that conjunction happens, you'll see astrologers suddenly doing this thing of looking back into the past and then synthesizing what they find with the contemporary astrology of that time period. And there's a bunch of astrologers like Lilly or Bonatti or other people like that down through history that have gone through similar time periods.
Yeah, yeah.
So that seems to be what we're in right now in terms of the synthesis of modern and ancient. And you've made a really great case for integrating some of the modern insights and philosophy and conceptualization and scientific studies that have happened over the past century with all of that ancient wisdom that's been revived relatively recently.
Yeah, yeah.
Cool.
Well, hey, I got to thank you for allowing me to articulate some of the details there, because there are some things in my book that could be misunderstood if people didn't read thoroughly or didn't read all of it. But you've allowed me to, clarify where I'm coming from, and I appreciate that.
Yeah. Thank you so much for your time today. I know this is a 3-hour episode, so we'll wrap it up. But I encourage people to read the book. I tried to get as much in as I could. I just finished reading this like 10 minutes before we started, and there's so much more there. So I definitely recommend people checking it out because we've only skimmed the surface of some of the great things. I know my friend Nick Diggin Best, who read this and really liked it, he was telling me to ask you about a couple of figures. We're not going to be able to do it, but maybe in a follow-up episode about like John H. Nelson, for example, or Edward R. Dewey, and some of their work studying celestial cycles and how that's actually shown up. But maybe we can save that for a future episode.
Okay. Yeah, I'm not going anywhere. I'm just staying right here.
Okay, good. All right. Well, great job on the book. Thanks a lot for writing it again. And thanks for joining me today.
You're welcome. You're quite welcome. Thank you too.
All right. Thanks everyone for watching or listening to this episode of the Astrology Podcast, and we'll see you again next time. Special thanks to all the patrons that helped to support the production of this episode of the podcast through our page on patreon.com. In particular, shout out to the patrons on our producers tier, including Thomas Miller, Catherine Conroy, Christy Moe, Ariana Amour, Mandy Ray, Angelique Nambo, Issa Sabah, Jake Otero, Mimi Stargazer, and Jean-Marie Kaplan. If you appreciate the work I'm doing here on the podcast and you'd like to find a way to support it, then please consider becoming a patron through our page on patreon.com. In exchange, you can get access to bonus content that's only available to patrons of the podcast, such as early access to new episodes, the ability to attend the live recording of the monthly forecast episodes, our monthly auspicious elections podcast, or another exclusive podcast series called the Casual Astrology Podcast, or you can even get your name listed in the credits at the end of each episode. For more information, visit patreon.com/astrologypodcast. If you're looking to get an astrological consultation, we have a list of recommended astrologers at theastrologypodcast.com/consultations. The astrologers on the list are friends of the podcast that have been featured in different episodes over the years, and they have different specialties such as natal astrology, electional astrology, synastry, rectification, or horary astrology. You can get a 10% discount when you book a consultation with one of the astrologers on our list by using the promo code Astrology Podcast. The astrology software that we use and recommend here on the podcast is called Solar Fire for Windows, which is available for the PC at alabe.com. Use the promo code AP15 to get a 15% discount. For Mac users, we recommend a software program called AstroGold for Mac OS, which is from the creators of Solar Fire for PC, and it includes both modern and traditional techniques. You can find out more information at astrogold.io, and you can use the promo code AstroPodcast15 to get a 15% discount. If you'd like to learn more about my approach to astrology, then I'd recommend checking out my book titled Hellenistic Astrology, The Study of Fate and Fortune, where I go over the history, philosophy, and techniques of ancient astrology, taking people from beginner up through intermediate and advanced techniques for reading birth charts. You can get a print copy of the book through Amazon or other online retailers, or there's an ebook version available through Google Books. I also recently published a new translation of the anthology of the 2nd century astrologer Vedius Valens, which is one of the most important sources for understanding the practice of ancient astrology. You can find that by searching for Vedius Valens, the anthology on Amazon or other online book retailers. If you're really looking to expand your studies of astrology, then I would recommend my Hellenistic Astrology course, which is an online course on ancient astrology where I take people through basic concepts up through intermediate and advanced techniques for reading birth charts. There's over 100 hours of video lectures as well as guided readings of ancient texts, and by the time you finish the course, you will have a strong foundation in how to read birth charts, as well as make predictions. You can find out more information at courses.theastrologyschool.com. I also recently launched a new course there called the Birth Time Rectification course, where I teach students how to figure out your birth time using astrology when the birth time is either unknown or uncertain. You can find out more information about that at theastrologyschool.com. Each year, the podcast releases a set of astrology calendar posters for the coming year, and we've just released our 2023 planetary alignments and planetary movements posters, which are now available on our website at theastrologypodcast.com/store. There you can also pick up our 2023 electional astrology report, where Lisa Scheim and I went through the next 12 months and we picked out the single most auspicious date for each month using the principles of electional astrology. You can get that at theastrologypodcast.com/2023 report. And finally, thanks to our sponsors, including the Mountain Astrologer magazine, which is a quarterly astrology magazine, which you can read in print or online at mountainastrologer.com. Finally, thanks also to the Northwest Astrology Conference, which is happening May 25th through the 29th, 2023, just outside of Seattle. This year's conference is going to be a hybrid conference where you can either attend online or in person. Find out more information at norwac.net.